Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a tragic event, Naruto awakens the Rinnegan and becomes a monk. How will this affect the timeline? Will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of this new power leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy it. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 70, Clouds Part 8. I see now that the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. It is what you do with the gift of life that determines who you are. Mewtwo. Naruto groaned with irritation as he crushed another of the disgusting fleshy snakes under his sandal. He had the displeasure to watch as what he thought was Kusuna's unconscious body dissolved into a small nest of the writhing, wriggling things. With another sigh, he casually wiped his sandal against the dusty ground, trying to get little bits of the purple creatures off his heel as he looked around the forest. He couldn't sense anybody else in the near vicinity, so he knew Kusuna had taken off at some point in the fight, or he hadn't been there at all. He was just unfortunate that with all the dark chakra in the shinobi's body, he couldn't tell the clone from the original. Man, I hate clones. Naruto paused at that, feeling as though he had said something inherently hypocritical, yet he couldn't for the life of him fathom why. He shook his head of it as he walked from the clearing, not giving the crushed remains of the poisonous snakes a backwards glance. A few blurred jumps later and he had reached the tree branch he had left Shion on. Unfortunately, the pale blonde-haired priestess was nowhere to be seen. Naruto just ran hand through his hair as he looked about, sighing irritably. Would it kill the girl to follow instructions? Shion stumbled again as her feet caught in the low bushes and awkwardly placed roots that littered the forest floor. She was no fool. She wasn't waiting around to be caught in the inevitable crossfire she had always heard erupted between people using chakra. However, as her clothes continued to be caught by low-hanging branches and irritating twigs, she began to regret breaking away from Naruto. She paused, coming to a stop in a particularly dense area of the forest where only a few meager rays of sunlight pathetically streamed in. Hello. She looked around, hoping to see a familiar face blur into existence nearby. Hell, even to Yuya would be a welcome sight right now. Monk. Her head whipped around when she heard a slight rustling behind her, only turning in time to see the bushes settle. From the wind. Yes, she convinced herself it had to be just the wind. She was letting the dark and the isolation get to her. She was a proud priestess of Oni no Kuni. She shouldn't let little things like AHH. Her scream resonated around the area as a hand suddenly rested on her shoulder, causing her to spin around and naturally strike out at the perpetrator. However, she was surprised when her wrist was easily caught in a firm grip, her eyes going wide and beginning to brim with tears. Taruho. The young man smiled pleasantly at her when she rushed forward, burying her face in his chest. The man just smiled gently as he returned the hug, slowly wrapping his arms around her smaller frame. The young priestess never saw the thin purple snakes that emerged from the man's sleeves, rearing back slowly with their dripping fangs bared. Shion-sama. Similarly, the little fleshy snakes never saw the flash of the blade that separated their heads from their bodies. The priestess looked around in shock as she felt the blade rush past her hair, pushing off of the Taruho holding her as another entered the clearing. Taruho. Shion stared in confusion as the two identical men glared across at one another, their swords raised in almost mirrored perfection. The young girl backed away from them, now unsure who her real attendant was. They both looked identical. Damn it, she wasn't a shinobi or a kunoichi. She couldn't detect a henge or whatever it was the monk had called it. Shion-sama, you have to get away for your own safety. One of the Taruhos looked to her while still keeping his sword trained on the other him. The other bespectacled man looked around as well, sowing the same concern in his brown eyes. Don't listen to that impostor Shion-sama. If you run away, you'll be led right into their trap. The two men resumed glaring at one another as Shion stood still, indecisively. She didn't know what to do. Quiet, you shinobi scum. The two men continued to adjust their stances in perfect mockeries of one another, lending no credit to either being the real Taruho. No, you be quiet, you pretender. Shion watched helplessly as the two men began to shuffle forward, keeping their stances level as they readied themselves to attack. Stop this, both of you. Both Taruhos froze in place as they looked around at the girl, both of them confused by her sudden outburst. Only one of you is the real Taruho, so I'm ordering you both to put down your blades. She surprised herself with the authority she managed to muster in her voice. It contrasted how weak and helpless she felt inside. However, to her dismay, neither of the brown-haired men made a move to comply with her demand. I am sorry, Shion-sama, but when your safety is at risk, I must ignore your commands. Shion widened her eyes at one of the men before the other turned to her, just as much sincerity in his voice. I'm afraid the same goes for me, Shion-sama. And as if an unspoken signal had been given, the two samurai rushed forward, their identical blades meeting in a clash of sparks and metal. From there, Shion had trouble seeing what was going on. Taruho may not have been a shinobi, but he was a proud samurai before he had become her attendant, and he could use chakra to enhance his movements. Their blows became a blurs of movement, their feet almost vanishing as they twisted and turned around one another, vying for superiority. Finally they disengaged for a moment, one of them now bearing a few scratches across their arms and clothing. Your appearance may be a perfect duplicate, but you could never master the art of the sword like a true samurai. The injured Taruho just scowled as his features began to melt away, revealing the white-haired shinobi that had previously tried to perform the very same trick. This might have been amusing at first, but without that monk around, it's pointless. Taruho merely set his features as he shifting his stance again, causing the white-haired shinobi to smirk viciously. Oh, this isn't a sword game anymore, boy, let me show you how shinobi fight. The man suddenly vanished in a flicker of movement, causing Taruho to sweat as he lost sight of him. The bespectacled attendant looked left and right, checking behind him and even above him for the next attack, frowning when he couldn't figure out what was going on. Wrong again. Before Taruho could realize what the slightly muffled voice meant, 4 fleshy snakes burst from the ground beneath him, coiling around him faster than he could move before tightening painfully. The attendant grunted from the sudden constriction as he lost his grip on his sword. He found he could barely move a muscle as one of the snakes suddenly appeared before his face, bared fangs dripping with a noxious-smelling, viscous purple fluid. Taruho. Shion tried to rush forward and help one of her oldest confidants, but it was too late. The snake lunged forward, biting deeply into his neck. The man cried out from the pain, causing Shion to freeze as she literally watched the poisonous chakra spread through his veins, ugly marks appearing around the infected skin. At the same moment, Kusuna melted out of the ground as if it were water, grinning viciously at the captured swordsman. Little men holding pointy sticks should know better than to face a shinobi. We are your superiors in every way. Samurai. The snake suddenly released the man, allowing him to fall bonelessly to the ground, twitching from the pain of the poison. Shion wasted no time rushing over to his form, collapsing to her knees beside the man. All right, priestess, it's your turn now. Shion ignored the shinobi though, tears beginning to gather at the edges of her vision as she gently shook Taruho's unmoving arm. Taruho. She couldn't believe it, she had seen it, this exact moment, she had seen it in a vision, but she just couldn't believe it had actually happened. It was never supposed to be Taruho, not him, she just refused to believe it as she knelt there, shaking his body. No, Taruho, please, not you, please. More tears welled up in her eyes, staining her cheeks as they rolled uncontrollably down her pale skin. Well, Miko-sama, you really can show an emotion other than irritation. Shion's eyes widened a little as the body in front of her suddenly vanished in a puff of smoke. Behind her, Naruto suddenly descended from a high branch, quickly followed by a rather shell-shocked Taruho, the real one this time. But I think you should save your tears for now. The pale blonde just looked up, wiping at her eyes as she saw the very much real and alive form of her attendant standing right there. Taruho. She leapt at the man, catching him off guard as he was suddenly tackled to the floor. I thought you were. It was just like in my vision, I thought. She couldn't say any more as she buried her head in the chest of the closest thing she had to family since her mother passed. Taruho just smiled as he gently stroked her hair in a calming gesture. I am glad Shion-sama is safe. The two went ignored though as Naruto stood forward to face a very irritated Kusuna who was seething and already looking around for an escape. How? Naruto chuckled as he lazily swung his shakuju back and forth, the picture of innocence as the streaming light from above them lit him up. You aren't the only one that knows the henge. I'm just lucky Fu decided to teach me the substitution technique, it really came in handy here. A few seconds later and that would have really been Taruho infected by the horrible chakra you guys use. Kusuna continued to seethe as he slowly backed up, knowing he was no match for the young monk. The plan had been to lure him away long enough to deal with the priestess with the dark chakra clone, but even that hadn't worked. It doesn't matter, monk, we'll get the priestess eventually. Even you can't stand against Moryu-sama's full might. He made to dart from the clearing but found his path blocked by great walls of sand that had risen up without him even noticing. He turned fearfully to see Naruto striding toward him, eyes set and shakuju held firmly in his hand. I showed you the folly of attacking the priestess back at the temple. Kusuna rushed forward, hoping to blindside the monk with a quick attack, but Naruto wasn't fooled, easily diverting the punch to the side with his staff before striking him solidly in the chest with two outstretched fingers. You didn't listen. Kusuna gaped as he felt his right arm go completely numb, falling limply to his side. I told you politely not to attack us again after leaving the temple. 10 fleshy snakes suddenly burst from Kusuna's back, all aiming their deadly venom for the young monk. However, once again it was ineffective as Naruto's hands began to warp the air from the heat radiating off of them. He lashed out, scorching and burning the snakes like they were paper the moment they got anywhere near him, before one again lashing out with another lightning-infused palm strike. This time it was Kusuna's other side that went limp, effectively leaving him defenseless before his frighteningly calm opponent. And again you failed to listen. At this point Kusuna's eyes had gone wide with fear as he found his back up against the intimidating wall of sand. To the side, Shion and Taruho had broken out of their reverie and were looking at the confrontation with shock. Thin but strong arms of sand burst from the makeshift wall, wrapping around the rogue shinobi and binding him there firmly. This time I'm not going to ask you, or show you. Naruto's eyes hardened as he brought his shakuju around in a smooth flourish, spinning it elegantly. I am going to tell you. With a powerful jab, Naruto slammed the end of the old monk's tool straight into Kusuna's chest, sending the shinobi crashing through the wall of sand in a surprising display of strength. When he stepped through the gaping hole he had made, he saw his opponent lying weakly on the ground, unable to move his body or even access his chakra anymore. You aren't going to hurt anybody anymore, because now you can't. Hesitantly Shion and Taruho followed him through the hole in the sand construct that was now beginning to dissipate back into the earth. Arg! Kusuna suddenly twitched on the ground, his veins becoming more pronounced and turning a darker, sicklier purple. His skin became pale and pallid as before the three's very eyes his body seemed to wither away, becoming thin and weak. What's happening to him? Shion was staring in disgust as the man just seemed to age a few decades before their eyes, withering away to a mere husk of his former self. I took away his ability to use chakra, without it he can no longer control the darker chakra that's been implanted into his body. As if to prove that, a multitude of those horrible fleshy snakes burst from the man's body, quickly wriggling away before they too simply dissipated into a noxious purple smoke. So he's still alive. Naruto nodded grimly, never taking his eyes off of the desiccated shinobi. But he'll never be a threat to anybody ever again, that dark chakra he so recklessly used will see to that. Finally, when the defeated man stopped twitching but Naruto was still sure he was alive, he looked away, letting out a deep breath. Right, we should go find the others, we still have a job to do, right? Shion took one last look at the withered husk of a man lying on the ground before wiping away the last of the tears staining her cheeks and nodding determinedly. The group had managed to find each other again not long after their individual fights were over, continuing their dash across country towards Numa no Kuni. They had arrived very close to where the sealing ground was hidden just as the moon was reaching its zenith in the sky. Despite protests to the contrary from Shion, they had all agreed it would be best to wait a night before continuing, so they were all well rested for what was to come. Even Taruho agreed, although that was unsurprising considering how exhausted the man appeared after the almost day-long sprint. However, once they had all gotten ready to sleep and the briefly lit campfire had been extinguished, a lone shadow slipped out of their tent. They made sure to make a wide passage around Fu's tent as they knew the mint-haired girl was quite possibly the lightest sleeper ever. Finally they breathed a small sigh of relief as they got a sufficient distance from the campsite, looking out toward the direction of the sealing ground. Going somewhere, Miko-sama. The poor priestess nearly jumped out her skin as the soft voice suddenly spoke up from above her. She looked up with jerky, robotic movements to see Naruto look down at her with an amused expression from his position standing horizontally on the trunk of a tree. I needed the bathroom. Naruto just raised an eyebrow as he dropped from the tree, landing without even a whisper of sound next to the startled priestess. So far from the camp. Shion stuttered for a moment before scowling at the teen, crossing her arms over her chest as the fire relit in her. Yes, what of it? Naruto just shrugged nonchalantly, walking back in the direction of the camp with a small chuckle. Nothing, have a nice night, Miko-sama. Shion watched the boy go for a few moments to check he was really gone before breathing a long sigh of relief. Quickly and as quietly as she could, she took off in the other direction, this time jogging so she could get away from the others as quickly as possible. It was only after another few minutes of running through the forest that she finally broke out of the tree line, finding herself standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down over the site of the sealing shrine. Wow, you really like your privacy if you need to go this far. Shion just nodded absently before blanching, looking around slowly to see Naruto right next to her, crouching down to look over the sealing site with an interested expression. What are you doing here? She nearly screamed it but managed to control herself and simply ground it out between clenched teeth in a hoarse whisper. Naruto simply looked around and cocked his head in mock confusion before grinning disarmingly, catching the young priestess off guard. I promised you I would protect you, didn't I? That includes when you foolishly run off so you don't have to endanger the people you care about anymore. Shion felt her body go limp with surprise for a moment before she managed to catch herself, scowling at the teen. What are you talking about, monk? I came out here because I saw no reason to wait any longer. You only give those shinobi more time to get here. Naruto sighed with a lilting smile on his face as he turned back towards the sealing ground. The entire area outside of it was littered with odd mounds of recently disturbed earth. What makes you think they aren't here already? He casually picked up a small pebble before throwing it in a long arc through the air. It landed with a scrabbling sound near the middle of the large, flat area outside of the cave where Moryu was sealed. All of a sudden the closest of the burial mound-like structures burst open, revealing a tall, broad statue-like being covered in intricate, traditional armor that looked around for a few moments for the source of the disturbance. When it didn't find anything, it squatted back down, piling earth back on top of itself as camouflage. It never heard Shion's slight gasp of surprise. Moryu's ghost army, and I was about to walk out there. Shion paled at the thought of walking out amongst hundreds of virtually invulnerable stone soldiers that wouldn't hesitate to destroy her without mercy or even conscious thought. You know, I'm almost surprised you would do something so noble. Shion shook her head, Naruto's voice managing to somehow worm into her mind and settle her doubts for the moment. It just had a very soothing effect on her, at least until she thought back to what he actually said. Stop twisting my actions, monk. I already told you I just didn't see the point in waiting any longer. Naruto just smiled at her, absently blowing a stray lock of his hair away from his face. Sure, and it had nothing to do with Taruho. Shion froze at that, looking at the other blonde with shock while he simply looked out over the plateau again. What do you mean? Naruto chuckled before sighing lightly, still avoiding Shion's gaze. You know, it isn't a sign of weakness to say you are doing something for the sake of another. In fact, all my life I have seen examples of people becoming truly strong because they have chosen to fight or act in the protection of their loved ones. Shion seemed a little lost as the monk finally turned to her, his deep rippled eyes meeting hers. But, how can I do it? Shion looked down, her shoulders shaking slightly as she felt the emotional walls she had spent years building up cracking under the monk's soft gaze. One day I'll wake up, my bell will ring and I'll see his death. Then I will just have to wait for it, unable to do anything to stop it. She jerked a little when he felt Naruto rest his hand on her shoulder, making her look up. You can't believe that just because you see the future doesn't mean there's nothing you can do to stop it. You have to keep hoping that there is some way to change it, lose that hope and then there really is nothing to do but wait and watch it happen for real. He smiled lightly and held out his hand while Xian just stared at it dumbly. Come on, just this once I'll let you be selfish. After a small moment's hesitation Xian gently took the offered hand, however she was unprepared as Naruto suddenly took off from the ground, leaping right over the plateau and taking her with him. What are you doing? She thought her voice might have been lost in the rushing winds as the two practically glided through the air, however Naruto seemed to hear her anyway, turning and smiling at her. For just a moment the young monk was framed by the moon, the ethereal light it cast making his golden hair glow, and just like that Xian lost her voice. The moment passed though, and after another few seconds they touched down softly on the other side of the plateau, right next to the mouth of the cave. Right, go on then, I'll be with you in a few minutes. Xian blinked, looking between the blonde and the cave entrance. She could practically feel the great power that was locked inside. You aren't coming. Naruto just smiled comfortingly as he gestured backwards with his hand. I'll be dealing with those. Xian looked over his shoulder to see the multitude of earthen mounds begin to break apart, revealing the intimidating stone warriors encased within. Are you going to be okay? Naruto simply grinned, holding up a strange cross-like hand seal she had never seen before. In a few puffs of bright white smoke there were suddenly 5 other Narutos standing in a line. I'll be fine, now go on, you'll be fine on your own for a bit. He turned, facing the oncoming army of supposedly invulnerable soldiers approaching them slowly. However Xian was frozen in place, unable to move out of fear. She didn't know what awaited her in that cave. It could be anything from one of the shinobi to Moryu himself. As if sensing her trepidation, the original Naruto turned to her even as the others dashed off, reappearing at the edges of the plateau, surrounding the army. It's alright Xian, you're stronger than you think, just remember what you are doing this for. Xian looked up at the older blonde with wide eyes. That was the first time he had called her by her actual name. Thank you, Naruto. The blonde just grinned as he turned to the oncoming horde, allowing Xian to turn and jog into the ominous dark of the cave. The blonde just grinned at the approaching warriors, slipping into an identical stance to the one being taken by the rest of his clones. Xian turned back to see the blonde one last time just as he began his technique, allowing her to witness something incredible. Each blonde took a deep breath, calming themselves as they limbered up their muscles before their eyes snapped open, each whispering as one. Mizu no Mai, Itaika. Then, just like that, the blondes vanished in perfect synchronization. They were mere blurs, darting and dodging through the stone soldiers like water through pebbles in a stream. They would simply lay their hands on one of the statues and in mere moments it would crumble away into dust, the chakra leaving its body. However, oddly, when they touched the next statue nothing seemed to happen. In fact, they seemed to become a little bit faster. Xian worried, thinking Naruto's technique wasn't working. However, she began to notice it would happen every time. One touch would disintegrate, the other, empower. It was like some great, intricate dance as each Naruto sped through the ranks of the ghost army, each one slowly spiraling towards the center like the arms of a great whirlpool. It was hypnotizing to watch as they got progressively faster. At the same rate the surviving statues seemed to become stronger. Xian shook herself out of her daze as she tore her eyes away from the amazing technique, turning and running off into the cave. She trusted Naruto to get through this. Finally she emerged from the darkness of the cave into a vast, open area that seemed to stretch on into darkness in every direction without end. The entire place was lit by the bubbling lava across the round, the room only made passable by the intricate and complex series of earthen bridges, only a scant few feet above the dangerous molten rock below. The priestess didn't let that intimidate her as she walked on, toward the center of the great room, where the seal still bound Moryu's body. You've grown. The voice stopped her in her tracks. It was deep, dark and unnatural, and her mind screamed at her to run from it even as her feet refused to budge. She turned slowly, spotting the dark-haired man that had been waiting for her, sitting slumped over in his regal chair. Slowly he looked up, revealing eyes that had lost their humanity long ago, eyes that froze her in place out of fear. You look like Moroku. Naruto continued to duck and weave between the powerful stone golems, constantly pulling and pushing chakra in and out of the rock warriors. The whole basis of this technique was to whittle down the numbers of a very large crowd by pulling the chakra from some before immediately pushing it into others without even fully drawing it into his body. Luckily for him it was perfect for this vile chakra empowering the statues as he didn't want it in his body to begin with. It would probably destabilize his clones. The other principle was to mess with his opponent's control by pushing more chakra into their bodies, however in this case it only seemed to make the golem stronger. Either way he continued with his dance, constantly aware of his clones' movements through their shared vision and their position in the larger spiral they were slowly creating. Eventually, as the numbers of statues continued to drop, their movements became faster and faster, as if reacting to some increasing tempo only they could hear. Then, finally, Naruto pivoted on his foot in perfect harmony with his clones, slamming his hands in a double palm strike into the chest of one of the last statues, at the exact moment his clones did the same to theirs. He pushed all of the enormous chakra he had slowly gathered in his dance straight into the construct, watching it freeze from the sudden influx of the dark chakra. He took a step back, an action mirrored by his clones, watching as the sick remaining ghost warriors started to shake, the overload of chakra in their bodies too much for them to handle. He breathed a sigh of relief as the stone soldiers simply disintegrated from the enormous chakra in their artificial bodies, running his head in direction of the cave. There was something there blocking his ability to sense fully, like there wasn't enough moisture in the air, however he could see enough to know Xian was alive and had begun to perform the sealing ritual. There was another signature there but it was weak. And it didn't seem to be doing any. Xian. Naruto's eyes widened as the signature suddenly rocketed towards the girl, the previously weak chakra exploding outward into an almost oppressive presence. He turned to run towards the cave as his clones dissipated into smoke only to be blocked off by even more of the stone golems. They were filtering in from the edge of the plateau, seemingly endless in their number. Naruto just growled at the ones that stood between him and the sealing shrine, building up the chakra within him to blinding levels. I promised her I would protect her. I will not break that promise again. Now, get out of my way. In front of him the ghost army just seemed to implode on themselves as the gravity around them magnified to unbearable levels, crushing rock into fine dust. However, as many as Naruto destroyed there always seemed to be more, only existing to keep him away from the shrine where he could protect Xian. He spun on a heel, aiming to destroy another of the brutes when it suddenly froze in front of him. A moment later the top half of it simply slid off the bottom half from a previously invisible cut. I don't like it when you take off without me. I get worried. Naruto had never been happier to hear Fu's deadpan, slightly irritated tone as the girl dropped down beside him, water swords held firmly in hand. It's good to see you, Fu. Unfortunately I need to go help our priestess. Think you can hold these things off? The mint-haired girl just nodded quickly as she bisected another of the lumbering golems, watching with thinly veiled interest as the two halves continued to walk forward for a few steps before crumbling away. Naruto used the opportunity to dash off, confident Fu would be able to handle herself. He darted into the cave, sprinting down the long passage that opened up into the great, lave-filled chamber. That at least explained why his water sense didn't seem to be able to work to its fullest. Naruto. He skidded to a halt as he looked over to where he could see Xian kneeling at the center of what looked to be a large, complicated ceiling array carved into the rock. He was just in time to see the ground around her break apart as huge tendrils of shadow burst from the earth, scattering stone and molten rock in all directions. At the same moment the ground underneath Xian just seemed to give way beneath her, giving the priestess only a moment to lock her widened eyes with Naruto's before she fell into the chasm of darkness. Xian. Naruto froze for a moment, watching the girl fall before he was forced to dodge out of the way as a massive pillar of pure dark chakra slammed down where he had been standing. He rolled to a stop, looking up at the four great dragon heads that had congealed from the solid chakra. They stared back at him with dark, glowing red eyes that seemed to mock him. Give her back. He could have sworn the dragons grinned before they rushed at him, each aiming to swallow him whole. He dodged them all, landing on another of the flimsy earthen walkways where he knelt for a few moments. The dragons recollected themselves turning and roaring at the young blonde, seemingly mindless as Moryu's true consciousness was elsewhere. The air seemed to become still as Naruto finally looked up, opening his eyes slowly, however when he did the great demons seemed to rear back with cacophonous wails. They cried because Naruto's eyes had changed, they were now a startling gold. Xian was lost, floating in an endless void of darkness that had no end of beginning. There was nothing here, truly nothing. This was her end, the powers of her bell would not protect her forever, then. The girl tucked herself into a ball, closing out the dark chakra surrounding her, willing it to just go away. However, the malevolent presence that was entwined within this place would never be so easy to defeat. Is this it, little priestess? Is this truly your end? To sit here and while away your time while the races of man crumble around you? Safe inside your little bubble. Xian tried to ignore the voice, but it was everywhere. It was the dark fog that surrounded her. It whispered and echoed in her mind even now. Do you not think there is a better way, little priestess? Join with me, return my full power to me, your mother understood. Xian looked up, spotting the small pinprick of light in the eternal darkness of this place. Mother. She didn't notice her little bubble of light slowly fade around her as she unfurled her body, looking up toward that glowing, hovering light. Xian. It really was her. Xian got to her knees, looking up at the light as she reached out a hand, her protective sphere of light weakening and flickering around her. The darkness around her seemed to sense the weakness, the fog and mist seemingly drawing in closer around the young teen. Yes, just accept it, little priestess. Give in to me, be with your dear mother again. Xian reached out, feeling as though she could almost touch the little hovering light. However, just before she did, she froze, fingers only a few inches away. And no. Naruto's words flashed through her mind as she took her hand back. She had to remember why she was here, to protect the people she cared about. She couldn't do that if she gave up. She would be letting Moryu win. No, she wouldn't allow it. No. She pulled back, the bright light around her strengthening as the dark voice seemed to scream in pain. I understand now, this power. She gripped the bell pinned to her jacket as the light became blinding, casting back the shadowy fog. However, before she could fully release the power contained within her, she froze as a warm hand rested on her shoulder. You've done great, Xian. She looked around, tears brimming in her eyes as the young monk stepped up beside her, a soft smile on his face as he gazed at her with brilliant golden eyes. Naruto. Chapter 71. Clouds Part 9. Time's quill is quick to spill ink onto a new page, Dan Bull. The misty darkness seemed to tremble with rage as Naruto took a step forward to stand beside Xian, the golden eyes of his sage mode burning with chakra. Thin tendrils of the fog seemed to flinch back from his form as if visibly burned by his sheer presence. With one hand he held a tight grip on his shakuju, with the other he kept a firm hand on Xian's shoulder, to remind the girl she wasn't alone in this dark, dismal place. No, this is impossible. How could you possibly be here? Naruto ignored the voice for now, turning and looking at Xian, making sure her full attention was on him and not on the demon. You've done great so far, Xian, but there's still something we have to do. The priestess nodded uncertainly, unable to tear her gaze away from Naruto. As a priestess, she had an inherent connection with the natural world and chakra, and right now it was like looking straight into the heart of the world itself. The chakra emanating off of Naruto was so unbelievably pure and powerful, it was as though she was next to her mother again. Not only that, but it was so bright, so very bright that even the dark, malevolent chakra surrounding them could only flee from it. She barely registered his words, too lost in the deep molten gold his eyes had become, a symbol of his connection with nature and its energy. Naruto simply grinned as he turned away, breaking the spell over Xian to gesture out at the abyssal world they had entered. Of course, we have to do something about this, don't we? His voice was so confident. His stance firm and his eyes so warm. Xian could do nothing but nod as he turned back, his gaze softening once again. Come on, Xian, I can't do this without you. The darkness seemed to vibrate around them as the light only Xian could see surrounding the blonde became visible, almost blindingly so as Naruto's chakra levels soared to unprecedented heights. You are the one that bears the accursed samsara eye. Naruto paused for a moment, the bright glow around his body fading just a little as he turned back out towards the darkness. You know about my eyes. The darkness almost immediately reacted to the teen's dimming, dark tendrils of fog twisting and contorting around the two until a large amorphous face appeared made from fog. Its two burning red eyes glared at the pair, but more so Naruto's rippled eyes filled with confidence met red eyes filled with millennia of hatred. Of course, even in my world I hear whispers of those eyes that felled even the mighty Shinju, the one who came before, the God-man. Naruto's eyes narrowed a little as the darkness continued to twist and writhe around them. He was the epitome of you humans, but while he was a man, you were just a child. The face in front of them grinned as it moved closer, only to grimace as Naruto sent it reeling back, the light around his body only burning hotter and brighter. With my power and those eyes, there would be nothing on this earth that could stand in my way, even my own body of flesh and blood could not compare. Naruto just grimaced as he felt the great demon's eyes roam his form with greed and desire. Sorry, I already have tenants and I don't think they would appreciate the company. Moryu screamed as Naruto soon became too bright to look at, the face of mist and fog dissipating back into the all-consuming darkness of the murky world. However, to Shion it was just a warm, comforting light that bathed the monk, casting away the shadows. You will regret this, monk. I will destroy you, this world and all of the worthless humans that inhabit it. Naruto ignored the demon though, turning back around to Shion and gently clasping her hand in his own with a small smile. Come on, this world is far too grim, we should really do something about it. Shion didn't even know what to say for a few moments before she found her voice, smiling back at the monk. Right. She felt as though the blonde's grin lit up the darkness even more than his powerful aura as he reached across, pulling her small crystal bell off her jacket. You know, I thought there was something special about this, I guess I'm about to find out. He held out the hand holding the bell and Shion quickly placed her own around it, both feeling it as the small ornament began to glow with its own light, equaling that of Naruto's. The blonde could only watch with amazement and an ever-growing smile as pure, harmonizing nature chakra burst from the bell, rushing through Shion's body as it naturally molded with the chakra already present. I feel it. Before his eyes Shion seemed to change, her body glowing with an unearthly light as pink markings appeared below her eyes and in the center of her forehead. Naruto almost wanted to laugh from the revelation, it was Sage Mode. Nature chakra rushed through both of their bodies like raging rivers as their glow only grew brighter and brighter, casting back the shadows and causing Moryu to scream as the purifying light burned away his blackened soul. Fu dashed down the darkened hallway-like cave as fast as she could, her sandaled feet pounding against the hard rocky floor. Ahead of her something roared loud enough to shake the entire cave, causing the ceiling to crack and a few loose rocks to fall down overhead. She skidded to a stop in the massive chamber, staring with wide eyes at the enormous construct of dark chakra at the center. It was as if some nightmarish hydra had burst from the lava that filled the floor, roaring and thrashing about as the demon tried to gain purchase in this world. Naruto was nowhere to be seen and Fu was worried. She had completely lost track of his chakra not long after he rushed in here, lost amongst the oppressive feel of Moryu's. However, even as she watched she realized that the dragon-like heads of the demon weren't moving randomly, it looked more like they were writhing in pain. Sure enough, a single long streak of pure white light suddenly burst from whatever dark dimension the demon had come from, shortly followed by another, and another. Soon a multitude of great cracks of white light appeared over the beast before with one last deafening cry of pain the body of Moryu exploded outward in one massive dome of brilliant white light. When Fu finally lowered her arm from protecting her eyes she looked on in shock as she saw Naruto standing right at the center of it all, bathed in a slowly fading glow. Around them great chunks of a dark ash-like substance floated down from above them, burning or smoldering. With a start Fu realized it was what remained of Moryu's body after whatever Naruto had done to it. However, she quickly saw the monk wasn't alone as in his arms, peacefully asleep, lay Shion, a light, lilting smile on her features. Naruto. When the blonde caught sight of her he waved with a grin causing Fu to smirk. Leave it to Naruto to act so nonchalantly after destroying an evil that had been plaguing the country for hundreds of years. He stopped though when the sleeping priestess in his arms stirred lightly, it made him smile to see the younger teen so peaceful. You did great Shion, you'll make a fine priestess yet. As he and Fu left the sealing ground neither of them noticed the small blush accompanied by a tiny smile spread across the younger girl's face. I'm sorry you couldn't find what you were looking for here. All 5 teens stood in the ornate hall of the Oni no Kuni temple. Shion sat before them, the picture of elegance and regal bearing as she addressed them, wearing her full regalia as the proud priestess of her nation. The 4 teens knelt opposite her in seiza positions, however despite the formal feeling in the air they were relaxed and the atmosphere was purely friendly. It's all right, a friend once told me that it isn't necessarily about finding what you were looking for, just as long as you find something worthwhile. Naruto sent a subtle glance Haku's way as he spoke, making the darker-haired teen smirk. Shion sat before them in silence for a few moments, still appearing perfectly poised and rigid before a grin broke out over her face, any tenseness in the air breaking immediately. I really will be sad to see you all leave, you know, even to Yuya. The redhead naturally scowled at the young priestess, but there was no venom behind it, it was just playful. The days they had spent at the shrine after Moryu's defeat had gone a long way to mending any problems Xian might have caused between the two. After her outlook on life had changed, the girl had become carefree, happy, and it became hard to stay mad at her. Although that wasn't to say she had lost that certain spark about her that just made her uniquely Xian. And we will be sad to go, it always is that way when leaving friends. Xian chuckled lightheartedly at Naruto's words, relaxing out of her rigid seiza into a more comfortable position with her legs folded to her side. You speak as though we will never see each other again. Naruto just grinned at that, his shikuju jingling as he tilted his head. Oh, we'll definitely meet again. Xian smiled amusedly, her eyes light and carefree. A prediction. Naruto simply grinned right back as he stood up, hand held out. A promise. Xian nodded concedingly, standing up and gently taking the offered hand. Very well, but don't think I won't hold you to that. She sighed a little wistfully as she looked up at the teen that had changed her life, in more ways than one. Such a shame that your heart already belongs to another. She looked around at Fu whose orange eyes were observing her carefully, looking for any underhanded moves from the priestess. It didn't take a genius to see that she had developed more than a small crush on the young monk after everything he had done for her. Perhaps you could have been the one to help pass on my power to the next generation of priestess. She smiled lightly as she saw Fu's gaze harden slightly before waving the girl off congenially. Maybe, but as you said, my heart is with someone else. Xian nodded, the sad smile on her face sliding away as Fu settled back down, still eyeing the priestess carefully. I almost wish I could come with you. I think it would be amazing to travel so freely like you do. Naruto chuckled as he rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. You make it sound so glorified, there's a lot of sleeping in forests and long days of walking too. Xian just smiled softly, gently laying a hand on Naruto's chest, a small part of her knowing this would be the last time the two would see each other for a long time. Oh, I don't think that would be so bad as long as you share it with people you care about. Naruto just nodded, it was what made his life bearable having those people by his side. But I must stay, this land will always need its priestess, Moryu was not the only evil to call this place home. She looked up, a slightly hopeful look in her pale purple eyes. But perhaps you could stay, you would always have a home here, recognition from the people and… She leaned forward so she could whisper into Naruto's ear quietly. I think I would be okay with sharing. Naruto's eyes widened a little as he took a step back, just the tiniest hints of a blush spreading over his face. He took a moment to collect himself as Xian smirked, glad to have finally gotten a rise out of the young monk, even if it wasn't quite in the way she had originally intended. I'm afraid I couldn't, I still haven't fulfilled my purpose in this life yet. Xian just nodded with a sad but still satisfied smile on her face as she stepped back, bowing slightly to each of the teens. Then I wish you the best of luck, remember you are always welcome in Oni no Kuni. All of you. Naruto just smiled as he stepped back to join his friends. Thank you all for everything you have done for this land and its people. Naruto nodded again and was about to turn around when Xian placed a hand on his shoulder. Wait, one last thing Naruto. The young monk was a little surprised when Xian took the bell off of her jacket and held it out to him. I want you to have this as a token of thanks. Naruto froze, his hands immediately coming up to refuse the gift, it meant too much to Xian. I couldn't, it was your mother's and we already accepted the pay you were going to give to Konoha. Naruto wasn't exactly proud of that but Xian had insisted, after all their supplies had been dwindling lately. Xian just smiled softly, prying open Naruto's hand and gently placing the small glass bell on his palm. No amount of money could ever repay what you have done for both this country, and for me. Behind them Yuya was about to speak up, no doubt asking for more money. Luckily Haku managed to grab her and place a hand over her mouth before she could ruin the moment. So instead have this, and always remember me through it. It has lost its power anyway, thanks to you it now resides within me again, as it should. Naruto froze for a moment before allowing his hand to close around the little trinket, a light smile on his face. Of course, thank you Xian. He reached around, placing the pin of the bell through his hair tie and securing it in place. He experimentally shook his head and Xian had to giggle as he let off little jingles with every movement. How is it? The younger blonde simply smiled and nodded. It's perfect. This time Xian turned to Fu, surprising the Jinchuriki as she walked over to her, making sure to look her right in the eye. Orange met purple for a few moments of terse silence as the two girls stared each other down before Xian spoke in a low, hushed whisper. I hope you understand just how lucky you were to have somebody like Naruto. Fu just smirked back at the girl challengingly. Every single day. Xian nodded once approvingly as she stepped back, never breaking eye contact. Good, because I'll be right there, ready to step in if you falter. The two continued staring at one another for a few seconds before they broke away. I wish you all a safe journey back home, wherever that may be. Taruho will escort you to the docks where I've made sure there is a boat waiting for you. Naruto nodded thankfully as the two groups parted, a small part of him wishing he really could take the girl up on her offer. After all, it was hard saying goodbye. Naruto sighed as he allowed the gentle rocking motions of the boat relax his body, his eyes dropping contentedly as he sat up on one of the sails of the surprisingly large vessel. They had left Oni no Kuni a few hours ago, and after the usual scuffle for rooms each person had gone off to explore the ship. After a while Naruto had found himself up here, Fu sitting next to him as the two enjoyed the serene air, gentle noises of the sea and a comfortable silence. So Naruto, what was it Xian whispered to you? Naruto nearly fell off the high beam as he turned to Fu with a small bead of sweat on his temple. What had happened to the comfortable silence? It was nothing, she was just wishing me good luck, that sort of thing. He chuckled nervously as Fu stared at him evenly for a good few moments, her orange eyes boring unblinkingly into his own. Naruto. The blonde just chuckled again nervously as her monotone, deadpan voice caught his attention again. You are a terrible liar. The monk's head immediately dropped down again, however he was a little surprised when his chin was caught in Fu's hand, the girl forcefully bringing his eyes back up to meet with hers. And you are lucky I don't care. His ringed eyes widened in even more surprise when the girl suddenly ducked in, stealing a quick kiss from his lips. However they immediately became lidded as she deepened the contact, sliding her tongue out to gently pry at his lips. Naruto gladly allowed her entrance, slipping his own tongue out as the two began vying for dominance. Even though she began the kiss, it was Fu who gave in first, moaning lightly as Naruto began to explore the inside of her mouth as he had so often done during their time on the island. It had taken them a while to come to understand their feelings for one another, but both were in agreement when it came to the physical side of their relationship. For two attention-deprived and generally unloved orphans like themselves, it was something they had been sorely lacking from their lives, and they threw their heart and soul into it. Geez, would you two get a room or something? The whole ship can see you from up here. The two quickly broke apart, their faces sporting identical blushes as Tayuya's voice cut into their making out. They looked over at the girl, straddling the sail on the other side of the mast from them, and both glared at her, making the older redhead raise her hands defensively. Whoa, don't get your panties in a twist, lovebirds. Naruto just sighed as he ran a hand through his hair, his ponytail had come a little loose during their kissing. Why are you up here, Tayuya? The volatile former Oto Kunoichi just grinned as she punched a fist into her palm. I was looking for femboy, bastard took the bed again, and I was just looking for him to recommend he take a little swim in the sea. Naruto just leveled an even look at the girl while she grinned defiantly back. She lived for riling people up after all. A person is only really honest with themselves when they are well and truly annoyed after all, at least in her mind. Well, he isn't up here. Tayuya just smirked as she stood up, showing amazing balance as she stood on the thin pole without even using chakra to cling to the surface. Well duh, I go that. She was about to drop back down to the deck when she looked back over the pair, still smirking at their slightly flustered appearances. Fuck, why don't you two just do it already and get it over with? All this mushy will they won't they crap is just lame. She laughed at the two's blushes as she dropped down, easily dodging the shuriken Fu threw at her from seemingly nowhere. For a while the two sat in silence up on the beam, trying to get what the redhead had said out of their minds. However, after a minute or two Naruto finally looked up, a hint of pink dusting the bridge of his nose. You know, maybe she isn't wrong. Fu's head shot up so fast you would have thought she'd given herself whiplash. What? It was rare to see Fu flustered, or even showing her emotion in any meaningful way, but right now she was about as embarrassed as you could visibly get her. Naruto just smiled sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his head, finding it particularly hard to meet Fu's eyes. Well, I love you and. He didn't get much further as Fu suddenly launched forward, capturing his lips again in an intimate and deep kiss. It was almost 3 breathless minutes later before they finally parted again, Fu practically straddling the blonde at this point. Please, say it again. Her voice was low and a little husky as she panted, trying to catch her breath after the heated kiss. Naruto just stared up in shock, never having really seen this side of Fu to this extent before. I love you. Fu just smiled with her eyes closed, taking in the moment before breathing out a long breath, a rare smile alighting on her face. Both of them were so caught up in the moment that neither noticed when the sky above them darkened considerably. I love you too. Her voice was barely a whisper and it almost surprised her how easy it was to say it. She had thought that such an offering of trust and intimacy would be difficult to say, yet, looking down into Naruto's deep violet eyes, it was the easiest thing in the world. This time it was Naruto who initiated the kiss, reaching up to gently cup the mint-haired girl's cheeks and guide her down to his lips. They stayed in that embrace for a long time, or it could have been a few seconds, neither was really sure. However, when they finally parted, rain had begun to fall heavily, soaking their clothing. Wow, this rain came out of nowhere. Finally having somewhat snapped out of their stupor by the sudden and bitingly cold rain, both teens looked up, noticing the odd storm clouds that had appeared overhead. That's weird. Naruto could have sworn the skies were clear a few minutes ago, yet now they were overcast with dark, dangerous-looking clouds and the seas were choppy. Below them the sailors had begun to scurry about, changing the rigging and making sure things were secured on deck for the apparent storm that had come out of nowhere. Fu suddenly turned down to the blonde, a new blush staining her cheeks that was mirrored by Naruto when he realized just how wet her thin clothing had become. Maybe we should go inside. Naruto gulped at the implication of the otherwise innocent statement. He was so caught up in it that it was only at the last moment he managed to grab Fu and throw her away, just in time to get her out of the way as the place where they had been sitting was engulfed in a bright explosion. Actual lightning struck the ground in 1/1000th of a second, which was why Naruto considered himself lucky to have only been at the fringe of the blast as he fell awkwardly to the deck below, his right arm twitching as blue arcs of electricity ran across it. Chakra-based lighting was one thing, but the real thing. He couldn't absorb that. Damn it, Kakuzu, I told you that stupid idea to get a real lightning storm going was a dumbass idea. Naruto groaned lightly as he got to his feet, using his Shikuju as support, looking over through narrowed eyes at the two men approaching him through the smoke caused by the various fires erupting over the deck. Above them the mast slowly collapsed, making a slow arc through the air before practically slicing through the ship from its weight. His vision was a little blurry from the smoke, but he could make out the bright red clouds emblazoned on their cloaks easily enough. Akatsuki. The one at the lead of the two, a man with slicked back silver hair and a large tri-bladed red scythe slung over his shoulder, grinned as he walked forward. Look, Kakazu, the little runt recognizes us. The man behind him, a much larger, more imposing figure with most of his features covered, merely stayed where he was, even as the ship around them burned. Shut it, Hidan, I'm still annoyed with you for constantly killing the crew of our ship. We would have been here days ago if you could just control yourself for once. You wasted my valuable time, and as they say, time is money. The first man just snorted dismissively, swinging his scythe about experimentally as he continued to walk forward. It at least gave Naruto time to collect himself, allowing him to work on healing the damage the lightning had caused. He cursed at not having sensed it earlier, but lightning struck from almost 2 kilometers in the sky and it happened so fast. Plus he had been a little distracted. Those heathens. They were barely worth the blood on my blade. A hungry look overcame his features as he looked around at Naruto. The blonde had managed to straighten himself out, but he really wasn't looking forward to fight 2 Akatsuki members in his condition. Already he was working on gathering senjutsu, but with the involuntary muscle spasms in his arm it was proving difficult. This one, on the other hand, he would make a glorious sacrifice for Jashin-sama. He took a stop forward but found his path barred by his partner, a firm arm held in front of him. You are not to kill the target, Hidan, we get paid for bringing him in alive. Hidan just grimaced as his hand tightened around his scythe. He raised it up to hit Kakazu out of the way, but of course lifting up a long metal rod was the worst possible thing to do in a lightning storm. Naruto was once again blinded as a bolt of pure white lightning struck the idiotic Akatsuki member, The resulting explosion blew both him and Kakuzu in opposite directions from the man. Not only that, but the energy from the strike finished the work the fallen mast had started, successfully tearing the vessel in two. Naruto saw none of this though, as he was violently thrown overboard into the thrashing waves of the stormy sea. He tried to flip his body so that he could land safely on the water, but unfortunately for him another arc of pain rushed through his body as the lingering after effects of being in close proximity to two different lightning strikes reared up. He lost control and plunged straight into the broiling waves, finding himself tossed and turned about underwater by the violent and unpredictable currents beneath the waves. Finally, when his breath was burning in his lungs, he broke the surface of the water and managed to climb up onto it, his legs a little shaky but his control quickly returning. Immediately he looked around but was a little shocked to see he had lost sight of the boat somewhere in the confusion. He wasn't sure how long he had been pulled under the water or for how far, but with his ability to sense through the water being disrupted by the irritating electricity in his system, he couldn't find out. Normally he would simply jump up and try and spot it amongst the roiling waves, but as the Akatsuki member had proven, being high up in an ongoing lightning storm was a terrible idea. He took a step forward, nodding when his foot didn't sink into the water before taking off at a run. He had no particular direction, but he generally went with the direction of the large, rolling waves, hopefully that would be the way the ship had gone, or at least the remains of it. He considered summoning his friends. After all, if he had survived, then that other Akatsuki member probably had, and that meant Fu was still in danger from them. However, he couldn't be sure what condition they were in and didn't want to risk bringing them out here to the middle of the ocean. He resolved to simply run faster and hope he could get to some form of land fast enough that it wouldn't be an issue. Unfortunately for him, it was almost 2 hours later before he finally found land, and by that point he was severely drained. Even his large reserves weren't infinite, and 2 hours of pure water walking took its toll. However, on the plus side, when he finally staggered onto the shore, he could see evidence of the ship, bits of wreckage and wood that had washed up on the sandy shores. Taking a moment just to catch his breath and make sure he had gotten rid of the last traces of that lightning, he quickly molded his chakra. Kuchios. He slammed his hands down, waiting with bated breath. However, nothing happened. The usual sealing matrix did not appear. In fact, it felt as though something was blocking his chakra from actually spreading out in the desired way. He frowned, figuring his control must still be a little off, as he tried again, only to get the exact same result. This time his brow furrowed deeply as he stared at his hands, wondering just what that lightning strike had done to him. However, before he could try for a third time, he couldn't help but look towards what he assumed was the center of the island, where he could feel a large amount of chakra gathering for something. Welcome one and all. I am your game master, Hiroto Masaka. Of all the things the blonde might have been expecting, it certainly wasn't for an enormous projection of a man almost a mile high. He spoke with an enthusiastic, eccentric tone, only backed up by the odd clothes he wore. It seemed to be an all-white suit with a very high-collared white robe that fanned out at the back. Going with the theme, his hair was also a startling white, spiking out in random directions to give him a slightly crazed look. However, his eyes, hidden partially by a set of rectangular glasses, glinted with the light of a conniving intelligence. Now that all the contestants have arrived, I would like to formally welcome you all to Uzu no Kuni. The projection grinned broadly, pausing as if for some invisible audience to cheer or clap. However, the news still startled Naruto a little. He was on Uzu no Kuni. That meant the place where the man was projecting his image from was probably Uzushiogakure, near the center of the island. This was where Hinoka had gone, wasn't it? I know, you must all be excited and confused, but fret not. The man enthusiastically raised a hand to the sky, a much more significant gesture considering the projection could actually reach into the clouds. The rules for this little game are very simple. You, the contestants, must fight one another in order to progress further into the island. You will meet in pre-designated areas guarded by special seals. The instructions given by the seals must be followed or the consequences will be. The man grinned a more devious smile, unpleasant. His expression lightened up again quickly as he clapped his hands together excitedly. However, for the winner only riches and wonders await in the ruins of Uzushio itself. You may notice that you are unable to use your chakra. Those are the legendary seals of the Uzumaki themselves. They span the entire island. You will only be able to use your chakra in one of the designated areas for fighting. The massive projection began to flicker and fade, obviously running out of chakra to power it. Now, good luck contestants. I have high expectations of you all. The man gave a final grin as the projection finally faded away into small specks of light, his final words echoing across the entire island. Let the games begin. Chapter 72, Clouds Part 10. You can't have everything. Where would you put it, Stephen Wright? Tayuya grumbled to herself as she walked through the island's unnaturally thick forest, ducking under low-hanging branches and slicing through the irritating vines that hung in her way with a kunai she always kept tucked into her waistband. First she wakes up on some godforsaken jungle island, floating on a stupid piece of driftwood, then she finds she for some reason can't use any chakra. Next that massive projection tells her she's entered some kind of messed up fighting tournament across the entire island. Just what the hell was going on here, and why hadn't Naruto summoned her yet? She just continued to mutter profanities to herself as she stalked through the foliage, hoping to get some answers in this Uzushio place the projection mentioned. It was her own fault really, she saw those two Akatsuki guys on the boat and just had to rush in to try and help Naruto. Being caught on the edge of a full-on, genuine lightning strike was bloody painful, she could definitely attest to that. She never noticed as she crossed an invisible line on the ground that began to glow as soon as she stepped in, however she definitely noticed the slight hum as a very complex seal activated. Acting on instinct she dashed to the side, expecting some kind of trap like an exploding tag or a barrier, well she was half right anyway. After a moment of nothing happening she looked up, blinking in surprise when nothing appeared amiss. Just to be safe though she turned back, looking to skirt this area in case there was some other trap that wasn't a dud. However to her intense surprise and immediate irritation she didn't take more than 2 steps before crashing into some invisible wall. Arg damn it. She bounced back off whatever it was onto her ass, sitting there for a moment just rubbing her forehead. When she looked up against she saw the barrier she had stepped into slowly fade away, only an almost invisible ripple in the air revealing where it had been. Experimentally she reached out and brushed her fingers along it, marveling when floating kanji sprung up wherever her fingers made contact with the invisible wall. Tayuya was no novice when it came to sealing. Orochimaru had always told her she had certain knack for it, especially barriers. However the sheer complexity of this warding barrier was so unbelievably beyond her she couldn't help but just stare for a few moments. Kanji flowed from one array to another like an ever-moving masterpiece, all done in flawless calligraphy that simply hung there in the air, impassable. So was this one of those pre-designated fighting areas that stupid projection had talked about? Tayuya turned and walked a bit further into the sealed-off area, trying to remember what the white-haired crazy guy had said. There was some kind of condition she had to meet right. Or some rule she had to follow. Tayuya groaned piteously, suddenly wishing she had paid a little more attention rather than just writing the man off as insane. Hey you. She looked around, eyebrow raised as someone new made themselves known. It was a large man in the typical dress of a sailor. Tayuya didn't recognize him but he was probably from the crew of the ship they had been on, figures she would get someone like this as her first opponent. Hey, you were on the ship. What's going on here? Who is that white-haired guy? Why can't I leave this place? Tayuya just sighed as she slipped her flute out from her chest bindings, confusing the man as she spun it in her hand once. Didn't you hear the guy you moron? We have to fight to get closer to the center of the island and knowing Naruto and the others, that's exactly where they're heading. The man still seemed confused causing Tayuya to grunt with irritation as she brought her flute up to her lips. Seriously, it means that I'm moving on and you're going to sleep so pipe down already. The man continued to stare confusedly as Tayuya played a quick melody over her flute, the rich tones drifting about the clearing as he just stood and watched her. What are you doing? Tayuya paused in her tune, taking the flute from her lips as she blinked in confusion. She was definitely molding her chakra into the sound waves yet for some reason they were dispersing almost as soon as they left the instrument. She might as well have been whistling instead. What the hell? She stared at her flute in surprise as it had never stopped working like this before. However in her momentary pause the man seemed to get over his own shock, staring down the much smaller girl. So what, we have to fight? Then I can get the hell out of here. Tayuya looked back up, slipping her flute back down into her bindings as she took up her taijutsu stance. She may not be able to use her flute, but she could still kick this civilian's ass. She had just wanted to be quick about it. Oh wonderful, we have our first contestants. Both of them paused as the silhouette of the same man who had projected himself over the island appeared between them. It was hard to tell who it was as the figure was blurry and indistinct with no colors or visible features save his outline, but the wild and spiky hair gave it away somewhat. Hey you, let me out of here you asshole. Yuya tried to hit the man, but her fist went straight through the insubstantial projection, almost falling over as she suddenly lost her balance. I know you must be excited to begin, but there must be some patience first. After all, I haven't even set the rules for this little fight, have I? I know. The man suddenly crouched down, messing with something by his feet that the two contestants couldn't see due to the limitations of whatever projection technique he was using. There, perfect. Both Yuya's and the man's eye were suddenly drawn to the normally invisible wall of their barrier where a few kanji had lit up in a deep, ominous red. No chakra. What the hell does that mean? While the sailor was confused, Yuya understood perfectly. Somehow this barrier could be altered from some base point, negating or limiting certain aspects of whatever was inside. Sure enough, when she tried to channel chakra into her limbs, it refused to respond to her. In fact, it was a little bit painful to try. What the hell, give me back my chakra. The projection of the man simply turned to her, or at least Yuya assumed it did. It was hard to tell when it had no eyes or discernible face. Oh, but then that would hardly be fair, don't you think? The projection chuckled, an irritating, mocking laugh that set Yuya's nerves on edge as it slowly began to fade away. Good luck you two, there are other games that await me. Just like that, he blinked out of existence, leaving the two alone again. However, this time it wasn't a kunoichi and a civilian sailor, but a very large, very brawny man and a much smaller, physically weaker girl. Arg damn it. I don't care about this shit, I'm getting out of here, and if that means through you, so be it. The very large man suddenly rushed the younger redhead. However, even without her chakra, Yuya was still trained in taijutsu and she was easily able to sidestep him, almost wanting to laugh as the man barreled straight into the invisible wall of the barrier. Aw man, I can't believe I was worried there for a second, it's like fighting a toddler. She slipped back into her stance with a mocking chuckle, her slight concerns by the man's size and her sudden lack of chakra eased. The man simply turned to her, rubbing his forehead and glaring at her. He took a swing at her with one of his big meaty arms, but Yuya easily slammed it aside, using the man's misplaced momentum against him as she slipped around him, soundly striking him on the back of the neck. PFF'd, too easy. The man slumped to the ground, completely knocked out as Yuya stepped forward and looked towards where the barrier still displayed the no chakra rule. Alright Hitoto, or whatever your name was, drop the barrier. I won, didn't I? She didn't get a direct answer from the man or one of his projections, but the barrier slowly faded away in front of her, the hum dying down to nothing. The redhead just smirked and strode forward, breaking into a jog as she headed further inland. She wanted to get this whole game thing over with as soon as possible. However, she had to groan as a few minutes later she took a step over yet another invisible boundary, the familiar hum starting up behind her as she walked into yet another barrier. Aw damn it. She stomped her foot on the ground and was a little surprised to see a small crater erupt from the contact. The former Oto Kunoichi grinned as she felt her chakra return to her, flowing through her body like a warm, revitalizing elixir. All right then, bring on the next weakling Hitoto. Almost instantly the projection of the man buzzed to life next to her, and despite its lack of face she could almost feel the irritation radiating off the man. It's Hiroto. He collected himself quickly, coughing into his hand as he gestured further into the forested area. And I believe your newest opponent has just joined us. Yuya looked to where he was gesturing, expecting another civilian sailor to come stumbling out of the tree line. However, her eyes widened in shock when her opponent finally did walk out. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Damn right I'm here. And you better be more of a challenge than all those other heathens. I can tell Jashin-sama was displeased by their pathetic sacrifices. Fu frowned as she dusted off her hands. Yet another of the sailors that had populated ship lay behind her, swirly circles in his eyes from the swift blow Fu had dealt to the back of his head. She knew Naruto had to be on this island somewhere. Something this crazy going on would undoubtedly have drawn in the blonde's incredible penchant for unbelievable situations. She wasn't sure if it was bad luck or good luck that brought him into all this craziness, however she did know she had to find him. The Akatsuki members could be here as well and she probably didn't stand a chance against both of them if they managed to find her. Naturally the first thing she did after the boat sank, or at least what had remained of it had, was take to the skies in order to find one of the others. However they had been scattered and in the storm it was like trying to find a single pebble in a pond. Then she had managed to find the island, or Uzu no Kuni as Hiroto had called it. However, almost as soon as she passed some invisible boundary around the country her wings had just faded away as she lost control over her chakra. It was only thanks to the large leaves of the forest breaking her fall that she hadn't broken something herself. Now she had been forced to enter some ridiculous game as the madman had said, playing around with people's lives, forcing them to fight. It was barbaric, not a game. However, she had no one to voice her opinions to, so she simply moved on, dashing off as fast as she could into the forest as soon as the barrier came down. She remembered the first conversation she had with the projection of Hiroto. For the most part she had ignored him, which seemed to really get to him. After that it had been one opponent after another as she slowly worked her way inland. Hiroto seemed incredibly annoyed by her lack of reactions to his various attempts at weighing the fights against her with his ridiculous rules. First it was taking away her chakra, however she had been trained to fight in such conditions before and was barely fazed. Next he had taken away her sight, however the man she was fighting was similarly affected as the so-called rules of each barrier appeared to be indiscriminate. Likewise she had swiftly won that fight too, easily finding the man as he panicked over his loss of vision. Finally, in the last fight she had been forced into by Hiroto, the man had not only taken away her chakra, but increased the gravity within the barrier by almost 5 times the normal amount. The white-haired maniac had hoped that because of her smaller build the much larger sailor would have been at an advantage. Fu quickly disproved that idea. And now here she was, running as fast as her chakra-lacking body would allow her towards Uzushio, hoping to find Naruto there. She did almost sigh as she crossed the invisible threshold of yet another barrier, wondering just how many opponents she would have to face before she could reach Uzushio. However, to her confusion as she walked further inside she could hear what seemed to be a conversation. Quieting her footsteps and taking it slow she crept forward, peeking out around a large tree to see a rather strange sight that instantly put her on edge. Standing in front of her, facing away from the mint-haired girl, was a man wearing an Akatsuki robe. "Damn it, I'm bored, we've been waiting here for almost an hour." Fu frowned, though when she got a better look, it wasn't one of the ones she recognized that attacked the boat, not to mention this one seemed to be part plant. Large Venus flytrap-like extension rose from his shoulders and his hair was a rather shocking shade of green. Which coming from her was saying something. Well, whose fault is that, huh? Toby told us to simply observe and yet here we are, trapped in this stupid barrier without even a way to get a message to him. Fu's frown only deepened when another voice emerged, seemingly from the same man, only it was darker and raspier, much more unpleasant to listen to. "It's not my fault. You were the one that wanted to get in closer." Fu took a step back. The Akatsuki member seemed heavily unstable considering he was actually talking to himself with 2 different voices. How was I supposed to know that the Mayfly technique wouldn't work once we were inside one of the barriers? Fu's eyes narrowed as she tried to come up with a way of getting past this Akatsuki member. Usually by now Hiroto would have shown up in one of his projections, but he was conspicuously absent right now. Well, you shouldn't have underestimated the Uzumaki then. You know, Madara-sama always talked about how irritating they could be with their fuinjutsu. At that Fu froze. One did not need to be a walking encyclopedia of shinobi to know the significance of the name Madara. Yes, well, it seems it doesn't matter anymore as our opponent has finally resolved to stop hiding. Nay. Fu jumped backwards into the air as a massive wooden vine suddenly burst out of the ground beneath her, trying to ensnare her. She managed to keep her composure as her wings burst from her back, keeping her hovering in the air, but inwardly she was beyond shocked. First this man talks about Madara Uchiha, then he goes and uses something suspiciously like Mokuten. Oh, I was sure that would have caught her. The first, lilting, slightly effeminate voice seemed genuinely disappointed, in an almost childlike way, as the Akatsuki member finally turned to the Jinchuriki. Fu saw for the first time that the man seemed to be completely divided into a white half and a black half. Then you are naive as always, can't you see this is the Nanabe Jinchuriki? Toby warned us about her. Fu's eyes narrowed again, wondering who this Toby person was and how he was so knowledgeable about her. If there was one thing she had come to genuinely dislike, it was lacking information. Oh dear, I don't think we're ready to face a real-life Jinchuriki, we never were the front lines type. The black half of the man just seemed to growl his agreement. What should we do? Fu didn't really appreciate them talking as if she wasn't there, however she couldn't really do anything until the rules of the barrier had been set up. For all she knew, she could be in mid-attack and completely lose her chakra. She couldn't risk that without knowing more about this Akatsuki member's techniques and fighting style, however from what she had seen it didn't bode well for her. A Mokuden user was like a Jinchuriki's worst possible opponent. Quiet idiot, I'm thinking. However, Zetsu didn't need to think much longer, as at that moment the wall of their barrier rippled, the new rules of the fight appearing in bold red kanji. 2 enter, 1 leave. Both halves of Zetsu seemed to grin viciously at that. Perfect. Fu watched with increasing disgust as the Akatsuki member suddenly shucked his cloak, revealing that the divide between them covered their entire body. However, before her eyes the man-thing began splitting down the middle, into 2 completely separate halves. Fu had to contain her look of revulsion as thing, as it certainly could not be human after doing that, fully separated, each new half regrowing the missing leg but not their other arms. For a moment the 2 just stood there, flexing their new legs and suddenly independent arms before the black half grinned. I hope the game master doesn't mind too much if we bend the rules a little, after all, there aren't just 2 of us anymore. With that the black Zetsu began to sink into the ground, his presence vanishing entirely. Fu could only gawk for a moment before the tree she was hovering in front of suddenly moved, the branches suddenly swiping out to grab her. She zipped away, but it was close. The wood was surprisingly fast for having just been an inanimate plant. When she stopped, she spotted the white half of Zetsu still on the ground, a part of his foot seemingly merging with the earth as it grinned playfully up at her. I may not be a combat-type Jinchuriki-chan, but don't underestimate Zetsu's power. I am the land itself. Naruto steadied himself with his shikuju as he walked, using it to support himself. Whatever this seal was that was affecting his ability to use chakra was having severely debilitating effects on him. For someone like him, so used to having massive amounts of chakra running through his system on an almost daily basis, it was incredibly disconcerting to have it so easily ripped from him. Although whatever it was didn't actually seem to affect his ability to mold it, as it hadn't affected the 8 trigrams seal on his stomach, that would have been dire. For some reason his Preta path seemed unaffected by it all, and if he wanted to he could easily absorb the chakra powering this island-wide seal. However, that would have been severely inadvisable, as right now he could only absorb chakra, not expel it. To absorb such a massive amount of chakra only for it to have nowhere to go, he would more than likely explode. Without disabling the seal as a whole, it would be pointless to siphon off little parts of it. Not to mention the fact it must have something feeding chakra into it, or such a massive, complex array would quickly lose energy. He had to admit, the Uzumaki that created it surely were masters of their craft. Having so long to work and play with Fuinjutsu, they must have come up with countless scenarios to prevent people simply circumventing them as a whole. As he moved further inland, his respect for them only increased. Things that were invisible to others were lit up like glaring neon signs in his eyes. Almost everywhere he looked, seals littered the island, some looking old enough to stretch right back into the Warring Clans period. The best part for him, or possibly the worst considering his current situation, was that he couldn't recognize a single one. They could literally do anything. As he walked, he noticed he wasn't encountering any of these so-called pre-designated areas Hiroto had mentioned. Not only that, but small signs of civilization began to become apparent. The occasional fallen pillar covered in vines and shrubs, or the broken remains of a statue, the face long since eroded away. The air was incredibly serene, and as he walked he couldn't help but simply enjoy the air. He could see why this had been chosen as the ancestral home of the Uzumaki. He didn't really focus on it, but being here, actually standing amongst the ruins of this civilization, that small, childish part of him that had yearned to know about his family growing up was being rekindled. Finally the forest began to give way to stone paths, littered with the signs of nature beginning to reclaim its lost territory. Here and there he could see evidence of what might have been buildings, small homely structures that had long since been torn down by either war or time. Occasionally he would spot that recognizable spiral that marked the Uzumaki clan, carved into the walls or on a faded, ragged banner. He closed his eyes for a moment, just trying to imagine what it must have been like to stand amongst this small village in its prime, with the walls still standing proud and fresh, colorful banners fluttering gently in the breeze. He released a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding as his eyes opened again, that image in his mind fading as it was once again replaced by ruins and shattered stone. He shook his head as he continued on, his footsteps softly echoing around the small outskirts. Village. He paused though in the middle of the road, looking up at the massive, seemingly endless wall of floating kanji that stood in front of him. It glowed with its own unearthly light, seemingly stretching on infinitely in both directions. He quickly realized this must be one of the fighting areas Hiroto had mentioned and also guessed that you weren't supposed to be able to see the barrier itself, otherwise it would be a fairly obvious trap. It made sense, he guessed, the only documented Dujutsu capable of seeing chakra other than the Rinnegan, which was thought to be extinct anyway, were the Sharingan and Byakugan. Both of those were solely in the possession of Konoha, an ally to Uzushiogakure, so naturally anybody else would be at a disadvantage against them. Naruto frowned for a moment, considering circumventing the barrier entirely. However, it seemed to go on for quite a distance both ways he looked, and he really needed to get to the center of the island quickly so he could try and put a stop to this pointless game. With another few moments of deliberation, the young monk finally stepped through, watching with interest as a ripple of light spread through the kanji where he touched the barrier. Sometimes he forgot how truly blessed he was to be able to see this invisible world of chakra and how beautiful it was. Excellent, excellent. You know, I knew there was something special about you the moment the sensory seals picked up your chakra levels. I've been waiting for you to enter one of the battlefields this whole time. Almost as soon as Naruto entered the barrier, a wispy, indistinct silhouette of the self-proclaimed game masters buzzed into life besides him, a grin on his non-existent face. Hiroto. Naruto inclined his head to the man. No need to be impolite to the man that effectively, or at least seemingly, controlled the entire island through its seals. Oh, and so polite too. The projection of the man seemed to lean against something wherever he was projecting from. The action made him look like some sort of mime. Ah, you know, I've been dealing with curses and screaming all morning. It's rather refreshing to talk to someone level-headed like yourself. Naruto could somehow feel the grin the man was giving him as he talked. The blonde just took the opportunity to walk forward, further inland. Naturally the projection followed him, even if Hiroto himself wasn't walking. It just seemed to glide along beside him, keeping perfect pace. So, what do you think of my little game, eh? Excited, thrilled, angry, disheartened? Do tell, I love seeing what people make of my brilliance. Naruto just rolled his eyes as he walked, his shikuju and the bell in his ponytail jingling along to his steps. It just had to be an egotistical narcissist, didn't it? That one man with the scythe was my favorite. He seemed so happy about the whole concept. Naruto almost faltered, but he caught himself, passing it off as a small misstep. The Akatsuki with the scythe had survived. But Naruto had clearly seen him get struck by lightning. No, it had to be someone else. Why? What is the point of it all? The projection just looked at him for a moment as if considering the words, although it was very hard to tell what Hiroto was thinking when his face was hidden like it was. Isn't it obvious? I wish to simply show people what is inside their own hearts. Nothing does that like pushing the boundaries between life and death. There was a moment's pause as Naruto actually, though the man was being sincere before the projection, chuckled. Plus it is all very amusing. I have to do something to pass the time, you know. Naruto just sighed as they finally reached the other side of the barrier. He looked up at the massive wall of kanji and frowned. He couldn't just wait here for some opponent when his friends might be in danger elsewhere. You see it, don't you? Hiroto's voice pulled him out of his thoughts as he realized he had been staring at the barrier for a few long seconds. Do you see it? The beauty of the seals. The Uzumaki really were artists, you know, constructing something as magnificent as this. Naruto blinked as he looked around and spotted the projection staring up at the barrier as well, even though the blonde was positive he couldn't actually see the chakra. You didn't create it. The projection scoffed, throwing a dismissive wave the monk's way as he turned back to Naruto. Of course not. I am brilliant, yes, but the expertise and the sheer genius of the Uzumaki clan is still beyond even me. No, this was created long before I stepped foot in this country. I simply commandeered it for my own use. Naruto nodded slowly. It made sense. It would take years to set up something this complex and ingenious all over an island this large. What was its original purpose then? Once again the blonde could feel the projection grinning at him in response as it waved a hand at him, finger pointed up tauntingly. I wouldn't ruin the surprise, you will have to simply seek me out in Uzushio. And with that the projection faded from existence with a small buzz of static. Naruto stood there a moment before sighing. It was tough being courteous with such an obviously insane man. After a moment or two he reached forward to touch the barrier, reaching out through his Preta path to absorb the chakra powering it. However, as soon as he tried to do that his eyes widened in surprise. Where he touched the barrier the floating kanji turned a sudden and startling red. A moment later he had to grit his teeth in pain as a lance of electricity shot from one of the kanji, shocking and numbing his arm. He breathed heavily, severely irritated by the amount of times he had been shocked recently. Although he had to admit that it was yet another ingenious move by the Uzumaki that had designed the barrier. All forms of chakra-absorbing jutsu were just that, designed to absorb chakra. Nobody would be expecting them to seal actual lightning or electricity as a defense mechanism. Given enough time Naruto was sure he could get around it, but fate had decided not to give him the time as a presence behind him made itself known. You know, for the amount of time you have managed to elude the Akatsuki, you aren't exactly subtle. I could hear your shakuju and that little bell from almost a mile away. Naruto turned with a pleasant smile on his face to look up at the tall, imposing figure of a tan-skinned man with most of his features hidden by a cowl and a cloth face cover. However, his interesting green eyes, backed by deep maroon sclera, were perfectly visible as they stared down at the blonde. Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Haku sighed as he finished creating the ice restraints for what must have been the fourth or fifth sailor he had come across and had been forced to fight. Naturally he had taken them all down as swiftly and as painlessly as he could, but it was beginning to grow tiresome. At least he was making decent progress into the island. They were just civilians after all, not on the same level as shinobi, even with his chakra taken away. As the barrier faded away he dashed off into the jungle, moving as fast as he was able. He may have kept a calm and cold exterior, but he was worried for his friends. Almost 2 hours and he hadn't seen a single sign of them. They had to be involved in this sick game as well. Finally he breathed a small sigh of relief as in the distance he heard a very familiar string of profanities echo through the air. Immediately taking off in the direction he could hear to Yuya he dropped down a small cliff face, rolling to cushion the fall. However, he almost blanched as he looked up only to see a practically labyrinthian construction of degraded buildings and shattered walkways in front of him, no doubt the remains of some fringe town to Uzushio. However, now it might as well have been built as a maze because without chakra it was going to take him a while just to get through it. The sounds of fighting he could hear into Yuya's direction didn't do anything to ease his mood as he took off, trying to pick what he thought was the best path he could through the twisting, dilapidated streets. After a few wrong turns though he finally seemed to get on the right track. He skidded around a building that was in slightly better condition than the others and crested a small hill before he finally caught sight of Yuya's long red hair. As he got closer he saw she was fighting an Akatsuki member, and that alone made him pick up his pace. However, something seemed to be wrong. Yuya was just standing there, unmoving, and the Akatsuki was doing the same, standing on some kind of red symbol on the ground. However, before he got any closer he ran into an invisible wall, kanji rippling out from the contact. His paused in confusion though as the Akatsuki suddenly lifted the long, extendable spike he was holding and plunged it straight through his own heart. For a moment he thought Yuya must have gotten to him with a genjutsu in one, and he breathed a small sigh of relief, only for it to die in his throat a moment later when Yuya collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest. No. He could see the redhead cough up blood while the Akatsuki member stayed standing, a sick grin on his oddly transformed face. He pulled the spike out of his own chest like it was a toothpick, eagerly licking up the blood staining the tip as Yuya fell even further, struggling to support herself on one hand before she finally fell forward. Even from this distance Haku could literally see her breaths coming out slower and slower. Yuya. Chapter 73, Clouds Part 11. The loss of young first love is so painful that it borders on the ludicrous. Maya Angelou. What the fuck? How are you still alive? I watched you get roasted by that lightning bolt. Yuya stared in shock as Hidan walked forward, The man's Akatsuki robe was completely burned away at the top, only leaving tatters to hang around his waist and expose his torso. Likewise, his hair looked a little more singed and frizzed than it had before, and it looked like a poor attempt to smooth it back down again had been made. However, other than that, and unbelievably for the redhead, he looked perfectly okay. He didn't even have a scorch or a burn mark anywhere on his skin. Yeah, and I'm gonna get that bastard Kakuzu back for it when I catch up to him. That asshole caused my talisman to melt. He put his hand to his chest where a small metal, something, hung on a severely singed wire around his neck. It may have been something recognizable once, but a few thousand volts had seen it turned into nothing more than a warped metal lump. Similarly, the scythe held comfortably in the man's hand was worse for wear. The blades themselves seemed okay, but the shaft of the weapon itself was a little twisted and deformed from the intense heat. And no way, there's no way you could have walked out of that without a scratch when your weapons took damage. Tayuya took a step back, some base instinct in her body telling her to get far away from this impossible freak of nature. However, at the same time, Hidan's eyes gleamed like a predator as he swung his scythe flamboyantly before slamming the end onto the ground. Of course, you heathen. Jashin-sama has bestowed his gift on me, so that I can continue to offer him sacrifices forever. His head dipped lower as his grin became more vicious, the firm grip he had on his scythe tightening until his knuckles went white. Now come, share in the sweet ecstasy of pain with me. Tayuya took another step back, which made Hidan's grin only widen, the smell of fear becoming thick in the air. However, the redhead quickly caught herself, shaking off the strange vibe she had been getting as her features reaffirmed into her natural scowl. Fuck off, you freak. Hidan just laughed up into the sky as he twirled his staff into the sky, catching it as he took a loose but confident stance. That's right, it's no fun for me or Jashin-sama when they go down easily. Fight for your life, make the blood you spill on the floor even sweeter for Jashin-sama. Tayuya growled lowly, trying to block out the man's hysterical shouts as he slipped her flute out from her cleavage in a swift movement, bringing it up to her lips before Hidan could even look down. When he did, the silver-haired cultist blinked in mild confusion as a sweet, hunting melody drifted throughout the clearing. Sorry harlot, Jashin-sama doesn't take musical offerings, only blood. The Jashinist suddenly rocketed forward, grinning as he swung his scythe in a wide arc to cut down the redhead's front. He didn't want to kill her after all, not yet anyway. However, he stumbled when the Tayuya in front of him faded away, her body breaking down into ash and dust that just floated away, unaffected by his swing. The man looked around for a few seconds, slinging the weapon back up onto his shoulder as he casually glanced about, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. Pretty neat trick, girly, but did you really need the stupid flute to do it? Get a fucking cooler instrument, like a guitar. He whirled around, striking out with his scythe as he felt a presence behind him, only to gawk as the gleaming red blades passed straight under the disembodied upper half of his opponent. Tayuya just grinned as her torso floated there, dust and ash streaming from where her legs should have been as she spanned the flute between her fingers, even though the melody seemed to continue on without her playing. Get a clue, freak, the flute's the best instrument there is. As if to prove it, the floating redhead suddenly lunged forward faster than Hidan could react and jammed the long metal instrument straight into his eye. The silver-haired side wielder staggered back, clutching the metal pipe as he cried out in pain and anger. Arg damn it. Tayuya suppressed a grimace as almost immediately the man pulled the flute out of his eye's socket, blood and viscera spurting from the wound as he put a hand up to cover it. Aw, fuck you, bitch. That actually fucking hurt. However, as shocked as Tayuya was before, it was nothing compared to when the man took his hand away, revealing his eye was now perfectly fine, if not caked with blood. The Jashinist wiped away the fluid covering his eye and grinned, swinging his scythe again. I knew you were going to be fun. Your sacrifice will definitely please Jashin-sama. Tayuya took a step back, or would have if she wasn't just a floating torso. What in Kami's name are you, you freak? Hidan suddenly gained a look of intense rage as he lunged forward, looking to viciously bisect the redhead down the middle. However, his scythe met no resistance as Tayuya's body once again dissolved away into ash and dust. Don't speak that blasphemous god to me. Jashin-sama is the one true lord. Hidan glanced around again for his slippery opponent, however he wasn't left hanging for long before the ground beneath him suddenly exploded upwards. Vicious black chains burst from the ground, each adorned with barbed blades or gleaming. Metal hooks that almost instantly drove themselves into the Jashinist's flesh. He cried out again as skin and muscle was torn open by the deadly chains, screaming profanities to no one in particular as Yuya reformed in front of him. "Now stay down, you freak." She watched him for a few more seconds as the man panted raggedly, looking down at the ground as the rest of his body was immobilized by the tautening chains. However, the redhead couldn't help but take a step back as his head suddenly shot up and the cultist grinned at her madly. His hair was caked with his own blood and a thick stream of it dripped down his face between his eyes, making him appear crazed and deranged. "No, no, no. I don't think you understood, you bitch. We're supposed to share the pain. Right now I'm taking it all myself." Yuya frowned as even more chains burst from the earth, grabbing onto every open bit of flesh on the man until only his head remained, appearing as though it was sitting on a small pile of dark black metal. "Man, I wasn't expecting a genjutsu. That's such a fucking cowardly technique like that bastard Itachi uses." Before Yuya knew what was happening, Hidan suddenly reached down and viciously ripped out a chunk of his arm with his bare teeth. The world around them suddenly shattered, the chains breaking away into nothing as Yuya's form snapped into focus, no longer streaming ash and dust. She was so surprised by the manner the man had used to break her genjutsu she couldn't react in time as he rushed forward, grabbing her by the throat and throwing her clean across the clearing. She managed to turn in the air and just about land horizontally on a tree, but she couldn't rest at all before she had to suddenly lean back, watching as 3 gleaming red scythe blades sheared through the air in front of her face. All of a sudden she was locked in a deadly game of don't get hit by the vicious weapon wielded by the religious nut, as she dodged, ducked, dipped and dived to avoid being diced into little Yuya pieces. She didn't even get an opportunity to raise her flute to her lips again as Hidan was just too fast for her. Her salvation came as Hidan began to get cocky, giving larger, more flamboyant swings that gave her the opportunity to suddenly grab the massive scythe and use the man's own momentum to push him over her shoulder. "Damn it, bitch, just hold still, this is starting to get annoying, you know." Yuya ignored the man as she jumped back, bringing her flute up again as she began a frantic melody. Hidan blinked as the ground beneath his feet seemed to melt away as if it had suddenly turned to quicksand. His entire lower body slowly sank down into the mire-like substance as the trees around them broke down and scattered to the winds. He grimaced as he brought his scythe about awkwardly, having to struggle in order to pull it out of the strange swamp the genjutsu had put him. "Arg, this ain't going to work on me again, bitch." He brought the gleaming scythe around and raked it violently across his chest, gasping from the pain but grinning as the genjutsu world faded away, freeing him. He laughed as he saw Yuya still crouching across from him, looking down at the ground as she stayed oddly still in a 3-point stance. "Man, I thought you would at least run or something, bitch." Did the heathen finally decide to sacrifice themselves to Jashin-sama? Yuya finally looked up, confusing Hidan as her body began to change strangely. "I wouldn't count on it, you fucking freak, just had to keep you busy for a minute." Before the Jashinist's eyes, Yuya's skin darkened until it was almost the color of chocolate, her hair lightened at the same time, becoming a pinker color. Finally, black marks appeared under her eyes like little spikes, as if she had been crying black tears. That was all he got to see though before Yuya suddenly launched forward, moving so fast that she just seemed to flicker a moment before pain erupted in Hidan's head. "Man, I still can't get used to how good this feels compared with the curse marks level 2. Yuya stretched her neck out as she flexed, enjoying the feeling of nature chakra running through her body, strengthening her and enhancing her far beyond her normal limits. "Damn it, bitch, that was a hell of a punch." Yuya's eyes widened as Hidan walked out from the smoking crater she had launched him into, steadying himself on a tree stump he had crashed through on the way down. Yuya just growled as she shot forward again, once again appearing within Hidan's guard faster than he could possibly react. In mere seconds she unleashed a devastating volley of senjutsu-powered punches all over his body before finally grabbing his scythe and throwing the man over her shoulder. Arg! He crashed into the ground with a small shockwave blowing out due to the force of it. Yuya smirked at the crater his body had made in the earth only for it to drop of her face as he suddenly coughed. "Seriously, there's no need to make this so fucking hard. One way or the other I'm sacrificing you to Jashin-sama." Yuya took a step back as Hidan picked himself up, cracking his neck one with a sickening pop. There was no way he should have been able to get up after that. It would have shattered most people's ribcages at best and severed their spine at worst. What the hell, you asshole? Stay fucking dead already. Tayuya was on him again, wrenching the scythe out of his grip before turning it around and driving it soundly into his body. Hidan's eyes widened and he spat out a long stream of blood as the pole of the deformed weapon broke straight through his sternum. However, Tayuya didn't stop there. She kept driving the shaft through the man's body until it completely skewered him, allowing her to lift him off the ground like some sick shish kebab. Hey, not good enough, Hidan. Tayuya cried out as Hidan suddenly lashed out at her with an extendable spike he had hidden in the tattered remains of his robes hanging around his waist. She dropped the hold she had on his scythe to grip her arm, trying to stem the bleeding from the nasty cut he had give her. It's finally over. Tayuya took a few steps back as Hidan dropped to the ground, quickly picking himself up. The redhead just couldn't believe what she was seeing. Hidan was just standing there with his scythe driven right through his body like it was a splinter. She couldn't figure him out. It just wasn't possible for anybody save maybe Orochimaru and other freaks like him that had done something twisted to their bodies. This guy had to have some kind of unbelievable healing factor to take injuries like this as though they were nothing, or even be standing after them. No, Tayuya frowned at that. No kind of healing factor would save you from a direct lightning strike. That was just unnatural. What the fuck are you? Hidan just grinned, a gleam in his eye as he brought the spike up to his mouth, still dripping with her blood from where he cut her. I already told you, Hidan. I bear Jashin-sama's blessing, because of him I am immortal. He laughed before languidly licking a long line of her blood off the pointed weapon. Tayuya just tried to process that, stunned for the moment. There was no way this guy could really be immortal, could he? However, any chance of her trying to convince herself it was some kind of trick were dashed when Hidan suddenly grabbed the handle of his scythe, still sticking out of his abdomen, and wrenched it out. A deluge of blood poured from the wound as the man bent over, griping the bloody weapon with slightly trembling hands. Now that's what I'm talking about. Share in this pain with me, Hidan, be cleansed by it before Jashin-sama. Hidan suddenly straightened up and despite the large splash of blood across his chest there was no indication of a wound of any kind. Tayuya was frozen as her mind simply struggled to come up with an explanation for what she was seeing. However, unfortunately for her, that was ample time for Hidan to draw out a large symbol on the ground using his blood that he had just spilled. It looked to be some kind of large circle with an inverted triangle at the center and he drew it with his foot, using well-practiced, sweeping strokes. This is it, bitch. Slowly his tanned skin faded into a deep, obsidian black as white markings that looked like bones appeared all over his body, as if tracing out the skeleton beneath his flesh. Standing there, with his scythe in hand dripping with blood and the devilish markings that appeared over his body, the man could have easily been mistaken for some kind of grim reaper, come to collect her soul. Finally though, Tayuya had enough, snapping out of her shock as she growled, shaking her head to rid herself of the chilling feeling that had come over her. Put on some makeup, have we, freak? Hidan grinned maniacally as Tayuya suddenly rushed him, not even bothering to move out of the way as her blow struck him straight in the stomach. However, in the exact same instant Tayuya's eyes bulged out as her body was thrown back as if by some invisible sledgehammer. She skipped along the ground before rolling to a stop, blinking away her shock as she staggered to her feet, clutching her stomach as pain racked her body. She looked over, spotting Hidan doing the same. At least her punch had managed to do something, the markings across his body had vanished. Do you feel it? Hidan staggered to his feet, still grinning even as he spat out a wad of blood. He sprinted back to the symbol he had marked on the ground even as Tayuya rushed to intercept him. Do you feel the pain we share? She was too late. As soon as he stepped inside the markings returned, faster this time, and in flash he took out the spike again and swiftly jammed it into his thigh. Tayuya could only cry out as her leg exploded with pain, causing her to collapse to the ground. What have you done to me? She managed to get back to her feet but her leg was shaking badly, threatening to give out beneath her. Slowly blood leaked from a stab wound in her thigh, in the exact same place Hidan had stabbed himself. Don't you get it yet, Hidan? We are linked now, you and I. It is yet another gift Jashin-sama has bestowed upon us unworthy beings so that we can share in the agony and ecstasy of pain. Slowly he traced the spike up his arm, drawing out a thin trail of blood that almost as soon as it appeared was gone. Tayuya wasn't so lucky and had to grit her teeth as that same cut appeared along her own arm as if drawn by some phantom blade. Slowly the markings that defined her sage mode faded away as the nature energy in her body ran out and a whole new pain exploded through her as the full force of her injuries caught up to her. Unfortunately I don't have my prayer necklace anymore, Suggestion-sama will have to forgive me for cutting this sacrifice short. Tayuya's eyes widened in horror as the man slowly brought the spike up, pointing it back down at his own chest. You were a worthy sacrifice, harlot, but now it's over. Tayuya tried to move but her legs just wouldn't respond to her. It was in vain though, as only a second later the Akatsuki member brought the spike home, impaling his own chest in one swift and brutal movement. Tayuya. She faintly heard the scream from behind her as she collapsed forward onto her knees. However, before her body could fully hit the ground she found herself in a warm embrace. Opening her eyes she found herself staring into Haku's chocolate orbs, frantically examining her body. However, Tayuya had hung out with Naruto long enough to know that her injuries were fatal. No medical ninjutsu save from probably Tsunade herself could save her right now. Why, you were a little late, shithead. When she looked down she saw that half of Haku's body was emerging from an ice mirror that had congealed on the ground in almost an instant. She tried to chuckle but it only came out as a racking cough that sent spears of white-hot pain through her body. Suddenly Haku shifted, collecting her into his arms as he sank back into the mirror. The feeling was disconcerting but through the pain and the numbness slowly encroaching over her limbs Tayuya barely noticed. No Tayuya, you have to hold on. She almost wanted to laugh as Haku frantically looked over her injuries, green medical chakra flickering over his hands. With a great deal of difficulty she lifted an arm and pushed away one of his hands, the action feeling far too weak for her liking. Why, you're an idiot, you know that. Tayuya wasn't sure if the wetness on her cheeks was from her own tears or the ones dripping from Haku's eyes. She tried to ignore it though as she reached up, grabbing the front of Haku's kimono suddenly and pulling him down. The brown-haired Yuki's eyes widened as he suddenly found his lips pressed up against Tayuya's in a rough kiss. Slowly though the redhead's grip on his clothes loosened as the kiss lost its force before finally her head dropped back, unable to support itself anymore. Hey, I wanted to do that once before I kicked it. Tayuya's eyes were beginning to droop now, they just felt so heavy while her body just felt so numb. Haku was shaking as he stared down at her boy, watching her breathing become shallow and irregular. He knew he had to do something, anything, but he just didn't know what. However, as he watched more of Tayuya's precious blood spill from the wound in her chest his eyes hardened. He could still feel the warmth of her lips on his as he began to gather huge amounts of chakra in his hands. He really hoped this would work. Fu's wings beat furiously as she flew straight down towards Zetsu, using her flight advantage to come at him from above. However, her orange eyes widened as an enormous vine burst from the earth, wrapping around the strange white humanoid like some kind of wooden cocoon. She tried to abort her dive but ended up brushing her foot against the wood as she did a mid-air turn. She winced as her control over her wing constructs was shaken and she banked too much on one side. She just managed to twist her body to land on her feet but she still skidded back a few meters, digging little trenches with her heels. It's useless, Jinchuriki-chan, I know you'll defeat me sooner or later but I need only buy time for the other me to find your friends. Not only that, but your Biju chakra is useless against my Mokuden, even if it can't compare to his. Zetsu's voice came out muffled from behind his wooden barrier but the lilting, childlike tone was still evident. Behind her, Fu's wings dissipated into a sparkling dust of chakra as water began to collect around her hands. Quickly two long swords almost half the size of her body condensed in her hand, each with a gleaming edge that betrayed their element's liquid state. Then I will end this quickly. Fu's eyes set as she dashed forward, dodging and flipping over the multitude of vines that burst from the earth to try and ensnare her. Those she couldn't avoid she cut clean through, sometimes spinning to sever the tentacle-like wooden protrusions. Finally she touched down in a crouch only to immediately jump up, missing the vine that would have wrapped around her feet. Mid-jump, she twisted, stabbing her liquid swords into Zetsu's wooden shield and dragging them up as she completed the arc of her jump. Her feet touched the ground on the other side just as the great wooded cocoon split open, collapsing to either side to reveal a shocked Zetsu. Wow, you really are stronger than I thought, Jinchuriki-chan, this is a fun fight. Fu merely maintained her dispassionate expression as she turned on a heel, jabbing her swords forward to skewer the white man thing. However, one step away from him she suddenly found her movements restricted, she was so close she could make out the individual green strands of Zetsu's hair. Oh look. It finally happened. Zetsu seemed excited even as Fu continued to struggle against whatever was holding her back from stabbing him. Ugh. She grunted as she felt her chakra slowly being siphoned away. Zetsu had quickly backpedaled away from her when she realized she was immobile, so she risked turning her head. What she saw disgusted her. Surrounding her body was what appeared to be a thick white sludge that was constantly growing and changing around her. Worst of all, it seemed to have a face, more than one in fact, or at least the malformed mockery of faces. She could tell it was slowly sucking at her chakra, trying to drain it from her. Do you like it? They grow from spores I managed to plant over your body when the fight started and slowly siphon away your chakra. Fu took a calming breath as she managed to straighten up, fixing Zetsu with a chilling glare as her mind whirled to find a way out of this. Ooh, so scary, Jinchuriki-chan, maybe by the end of this I could get a little smile out of you. Fu's eyes merely narrowed dangerously before they gleamed with slight amusement, a smirk appearing on her face. They absorb chakra. Zetsu just grinned and nodded happily as his foot once again merged with the earth. However, his smile became smaller as the white gelatinous mass surrounding Fu's body suddenly froze, unable to grow anymore. Slowly the white began to turn gray as the previously smooth texture of Zetsu's spore clone became rocky and rough. Hey Jinchuriki-chan, what are you doing to it? Fu merely remained still as cracks began to appear over the clone's body. After another few moments, large portions of it simply fell off, shattering when they hit the ground. Zetsu's eyes widened and he quickly ran through hand seals, trying to take advantage of Fu's immobility while he could. However, it was too late. As massive wooden roots burst from the ground to ensnare the girl, the last of the spore clone dropped away, completely turned to stone, and Fu was able to jump up high over the roots, wings once again bursting from her back. Oh hey, that's no fair, Jinchuriki-chan. My parasite clones can't handle nature chakra like I can. You don't have to be so mean. Fu frowned as she stared down at her opponent emotionlessly. It was like fighting a child. Although I am impressed you know Senjutsu. That's a really hard skill to learn, you know. The mint-haired Jinchuriki quickly ran through her options before nodding once, taking a deep breath in before exhaling in massive cloud, enhancing the jutsu with the tiny amount of nature chakra she had managed to channel in the short time. Ooh, pretty. A bright, sparkling dust spread out from her breath, practically blanketing the ground below in a glittering layer of gold. Zetsu only had a moment to admire the beauty of the technique before he had to shield his eyes as light was reflected over and over and over again inside, becoming blinding. Fu watched on from above, immune to the blinding effecting of her scale dust technique. Slowly, almost languidly, she held up the tiger seal. In flash of light, the scale powder blanketing the floor suddenly ignited in a massive explosion that caused Fu to move a bit as the turbulent air waves created by the blast buffeted her wings. Slowly the smoke dissipated and the dust settled, revealing the ground below had been blackened and scorched by the technique. Cautiously Fu fluttered down to the ground, touching down as she kept a wary eye on where Zetsu lay on his side, his white body scorched in many places and his arm twitching. Slowly she walked up the man-plant thing, checking around for traps and deceptions before she found herself next to him, looking down at the odd creature. Oh, Samin Jinchuriki-chan, I wasn't expecting that. The humanoid's voice came out a little raspier than normal as he coughed a few times. But then again, Zetsu's head suddenly shot up to reveal he had a complete face as opposed to the real Zetsu's half face. Gotcha. Fu was suddenly trapped from behind as the real Zetsu melted out of the ground, quickly wrapping his arm around her neck in a chokehold. However, the creature was a little surprised when Fu did nothing but smirk, a low chuckle coming from her mouth. No, I'm afraid it's the other way around. Zetsu's eyes narrowed as he looked at the girl in front of him a little closer before suddenly widening. Shadow Claw. He got no further before a long watery sword burst through his face from behind, causing his body to jerk violently. Fu allowed her feet to touch down softly, her wings folding back into her back silently before dissipating. You may have been able to sense anything touching the ground, but I don't have to if I don't want to. Zetsu couldn't reply as Fu allowed her water blades to dissipate into the air. At the same moment the Fu in front of them burst into white smoke, allowing the plant man to fall limply to the ground. She stared at him a moment before looking at Zetsu's clone, now melting into a puddle of disgusting white sludge. Finally she just wiped her hands with a sigh and turned to leave, however out of the corner of her eye she spotted a small gleam of metal and stooped to pick it up. It was a ring. It looked fairly harmless but it was embedded with a small green stone and bore the kanji for Gai, which was often associated with yin elements. With a shrug she pocketed it. She had never really been one for the spoils of war but it had caught her eye, perhaps she could get it resized to fit her. Around her she heard the hum of the barrier fading and without another backwards glance she darted off back into the forest. She could tell she was getting closer to Uzushio now. I don't suppose we could talk before launching right into fighting, do you? Naruto had to crane his neck a little to look up at the massive man standing in front of him. He really struck quite the intimidating figure. It depends on what you have to say, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Naruto just cocked his head to the side with a lilting smile. You could call me Naruto if you want. The large man simply stared at him with his dispassionate green eyes with the odd red sclera. Naruto, Kyuubi. The name doesn't matter as long as I get paid. Naruto simply raised an eyebrow as he leant against his shikuju. He was glad he could at least speak with certain members of the Akatsuki. So you are a mercenary. The former Taki shinobi simply snorted, the veil covering most of his features rippling slightly. I suppose, although I care little for titles, a better word for me would be entrepreneur. My name is Kakuzu. Naruto looked up thoughtfully at that. He could have sworn he had heard that name somewhere before. He may have had a near-perfect memory but sometimes something just got lost in the filing, as it were. Now enough talk. I have wasted enough time. Oh, this island dealing with weaklings not worth my time. I have to deal with you and go find my partner before he does something else idiotic like hold a conductor in a lightning storm. Naruto sighed lightly as he took a step back, planting his shikuju into the ground firmly. So there's no way we could resolve this peacefully. Kakuzu stared at the young monk interestedly for a few moments before shaking his head. Not unless you have a few million ryo in your robes, which I doubt. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that. Really? Money? Kakuzu just nodded and for a moment Naruto considered it. Would it really be that morally wrong to create money just to get rid of a problem? The blonde sighed as his master popped up in his head, metaphorically thwacking him over the head for even considering it. Know this, Kyuubi Jinchuriki, I am not Sasori. I will not underestimate you like he did. I've lived long enough to know that any power that can harness the Biju such as Hashirama's Mokuton or the Uchiha's Sharingan or those Rinnegan eyes in your skull, are dangerous indeed. Naruto simply nodded with a sigh, taking a deep breath before his eyes snapped open, pulsing with chakra. Very well. Chapter 74, Clouds Part 12. I am prepared to die, but there is no cause for which I am prepared to kill. Mahatma Gandhi. Kakuzu raised an eyebrow as sand burst from the ground around him, swirling violently before suddenly constricting down on him. Naruto waited patiently from outside the localized sandstorm, eyes slowly roaming around. It was a shame he couldn't use his sand and water sense at the same time but the two were fairly interchangeable. After all he could still feel Kakuzu right in the middle. The blonde frowned as Kakuzu's chakra signature suddenly vanished from inside the small tornado of sand just as it violently bulged inwards. That would have trapped most other people but even as he thought that he had to jump forward, just in time for a volley of odd gray tendrils, no thicker than Senbon, to go flying over him. However his dodge wasn't enough, as proven when those same tendrils suddenly diverted, slamming down into the ground with enough force to cause rocks and dust to fly into the air. Is this really all the Rinnegan can do? Sasori must have been far weaker than I thought, perhaps I should have cashed in his bounty after all. The Akatsuki member reappeared with a flicker of movement, revealing that the gray threads had emerged from his arm. Slowly the smoke cleared around where his attack had impacted and he heard a light chuckle. When it was clear enough to see, Kakuzu simply raised an eyebrow again. Wow, you're fast, definitely faster than me, that's for sure. At least when I'm like this. Naruto slowly stood up, revealing that the volley of dangerous gray threads hadn't even scratched him even though Kakuzu had felt them all hit the blonde. Mildly impressive. You have some form of armor or defense beyond that irritating sand. Naruto just grinned as he dusted off his robes, now a little torn from the thin tentacles' attack. And you, are like a walking rag doll. What is that anyway? Kakuzu grunted as the tendrils retracted back into his arm like whips, returning to the separation in his forearm where they quickly wove back in like macabre stitches. Naruto imagined that wasn't the only place on his body those threads could leave or attack from, so he knew to be wary. I have no need to tell a brat like you anything. Naruto just shrugged as he lazily lifted an arm, tracking Kikuzu as the man suddenly launched forward. Normally it would have been far too fast for Naruto to react to in taijutsu, but he wasn't using his body for this. Shinra Tensai. Mid-air, a few feet from where Naruto stood, Kikuzu suddenly widened his eyes as he was sent flying back with the force of a small freight train, and he had been to Yuki no Kuni, so he knew how powerful those were. The man's body created a small trench through the ground as he ripped through it, tendrils lashing out at random into the ground to halt his crash. Naruto stayed where he was, gazing curiously into the small cloud of dust that he had created this time. Well, I suppose that is the so-called invisible attack I was warned against. It's certainly. A figure emerged from the smoke to reveal Kikuzu hadn't taken any damage either, although his Akatsuki robe was torn to shreds from the rocks he had crashed through. Formidable. He quickly discarded the bulky robe, revealing the gruesome form of his body. He had naturally tanned skin like many Tokigakure shinobi, but nearly everywhere on his body those gray threads stitched him together like some poorly constructed doll. You interest me, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Perhaps in a few years you would have had a bounty worth catching my eye. It's almost a shame you won't. Now let's try this again. Naruto grimaced as he heard a strange squelching sound coming from Kikuzu's chest, only for his eyes to widen a moment later as his hands both detached, sending another volley of the vicious threads his way. However, this time as he took a step back he raised his hand, causing the barrage of tendrils to suddenly halt in midair as they struck an invisible wall of force. The blonde frowned, knowing he couldn't let those near him again now, before the tendrils had enough force to actually dent his Asura Path's defense. However, now they were even more deadly as they were covered in a buzzing, faintly luminescent glow. Kikuzu had ran lightning chakra down the threads to increase their penetrating power. If they were to actually hit him, he was sure he would be skewered. However, even as his mind figured this out, the threads were pushing back against the wall of force they had encountered, and Naruto's 3 seconds hadn't quite counted down yet, so he did the next best thing. Bansho Tenon. As he held one hand out to maintain his Shinra Tensai, he crossed his other one over it, aiming at a particularly large tree on the other side of the clearing. Kikuzu was hardly unprepared as the enormous tree suddenly flew at him from behind, and instantly more threads burst from the ground, catching it and breaking it too before throwing the two halves to either side. However, it had weakened his concentration long enough for Naruto to move out of the way of his barrage of threads, leaving the two standing across from one another again. With every move you reveal more and more of yourself to me, bringing us closer to the inevitable end where I carry you back to the Akatsuki, where your Biju will be ripped out. It doesn't matter how powerful those eyes are in legend, I am a living legend and experience will always beat you upstarts. Naruto just gazed at the man evenly, sizing him up. So far he had only displayed this ability with these odd threads and a lightning affinity, but he must be a powerful shinobi if he was in the same organization as Itachi Uchiha and Kisame Hoshigake. Alright, I'll play along. Really, he was just stalling for time, trying to gather senjutsu as quickly as he could. Kikuzu was definitely faster than him like this, as Naruto was only 16 and he could only guess at this man's age. Kikuzu simply frowned as thicker, stronger-looking tendrils suddenly burst from the earth around Naruto, imitating what he blonde had tried to do to him with his sand. Do not think I don't know the signs for when somebody is gathering senjutsu. I know you need to remain still, so I won't allow it. The tendrils all shot at Naruto from every side, not leaving him any space to avoid them. Sand whirled around him defensively, but the lightning-enhanced threads sliced through it like it was water. Naruto was still getting over his shock that Kikuzu knew about senjutsu, that made the second Akatsuki member to recognize Sage Mode. His eyes pulsed with chakra and the threads were once again halted by an all-encompassing wall of force centered on the blonde, but it didn't buy him nearly enough time to gather enough nature chakra. Instead he had to dash away, skidding to a stop some distance away as Kikuzu turned to him with a level stare. The threads simply vanished back into the ground, making Naruto glance about warily. He caught the tiny tremors before the tendrils actually emerged, pivoting his foot to turn and run in the opposite direction. However, he could only widen his eyes in surprise as he ran straight into even more of them. Blood dripped from the edge of his mouth as he looked down in shock, not even able to count the numerous places he was skewered on Kakuzu's threads. It was pointless from the start, Kyuubi Jinchuriki, you are too young and too weak to have lasted long against me. Naruto managed to turn his head to look at the man as he walked closer to him. The blonde managed to smile even as blood continued to drip from his many wounds. Oh, I think I lasted just long enough to be honest. Kakuzu was suddenly slammed by a crippling force that sent the man crashing straight into the ground, creating a colossal crater and leaving a gaping trench in the earth that could have been mistaken for a dyed riverbed. The Naruto, skewered on his now limp threads, vanished in a burst of smoke after giving a childish grin. At the same moment the real Naruto rose out of the ground, his eyes flashing golden as he walked towards the crater the Akatsuki member still lay in. How's that for experience? Did you learn something? The blonde easily diverted his head to the side as another, tighter packed volley of threads suddenly launched at him from the smoke, reaching over and catching the gray threads without trouble. He felt the slight tingle from the lightning-natured chakra running through the tendrils but nothing else. He grinned as he quickly absorbed the man's chakra. The threads were an amazing conductor for chakra like his rod, so it was almost too easy. His eyes tracked the incoming wave of the dangerous gray threads as though they were moving through treacle. When nature energy surged through his system it was like the entire world slowed down. He was in harmony with it, able to understand the tiniest motions and predict how they would play out. As soon as the lightning-infused tendrils got near him it was as though they had passed through an invisible bubble. The crackling aura of blue energy around them vanished, drained away into Naruto's body. The threads themselves managed to get through, however they could only uselessly pound against his Asura Path's hardened metal skin, not even managing to dent it. You were right, you shouldn't have given me time to gather Senjutsu chakra. Usually using two of my paths at once like this is pretty hard, but I still haven't even found my limits when I tap into nature's energy. Naruto grinned as his grip over the loosely packed bundle of threads tightening, the veins in his arms bulging ever so slightly as he suddenly turned, throwing Kakuzu and his thin tentacles clear across the clearing with a grunt of effort. The man had been fruitlessly trying to anchor himself to the ground with more threads, but Naruto ripped him out like a stubborn weed. The Akatsuki member was surprised, but he still managed to twist his body to land roughly on the round, his feet gouging out small trenches. HMPFT, you may know how to access Sage Mode, but you don't even begin to scratch at the potential of the Shodai Hokage. You can't stay this way for long, I know that much. However, Kakuzu couldn't help but widen his eyes as Naruto suddenly blurred out of his sight. Actually, you would be surprised. The aged Taki Nuke Nin instantly lashed out with a vicious backhanded punch as Naruto's voice suddenly sounded right behind him. However, the blonde caught the fist with one hand, the force of the blow creating small shockwaves in the air. In almost exactly the same way he caught Kakuzu's second punch, grabbing the fist tightly as the small crater that had formed beneath the pair only grew. I'm willing to bet I can hold on to Sage Mode long enough to deal with you easily. The blonde grinned as Kakuzu continued to struggle against the young monk's seemingly infinite strength. Unless you have any more tricks than these threads of yours. Beneath Kakuzu's mask the aged shinobi smirked. It had been a long time since he had a bounty fight back like this. Oh, more tricks than your young mind could believe. Hundreds of threads burst from all over his skin, flowing out like a doll's stuffing to try and entangle the blonde. At this close range it should have been impossible to dodge, and he could leisurely strangle the monk until he had passed out. No need to kill the target after all when he was being paid to bring him in alive. However, he could only frown as he heard a light whining sound beneath him. Out of the corner of his discolored eyes he could the briefest flashes of light before he was sent rocketing back, riding a blast of what looked to be pure energy. Naruto simply maintained his grin as the cannon his hand had become finished cycling with energy, deconstructing and reconstructing back into his normal five-fingered appendage that he flexed experimentally. He had learned a lot from his fight with his darker half. If he had power then he was obligated to use it, but for the right reasons. After all, a jutsu or a technique is simply a tool and can be used for both bad and good. It was the intent behind it that mattered in the end. That was certainly interesting. Kakuzu emerged from the tree line he had barreled through, unharmed but not without a mark. The vest he wore beneath his robes fluttered to the ground, revealing even more of his macabre stitching and the large burn mark across his stomach. But if you want to turn this into a game of firepower, then you are 100 years too early to be challenging the likes of me. Naruto simply got into a ready stance, getting slightly irritated with the man's deep gravelly voice and all his self-hype. Get ready Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Naruto grimaced as that same horrible squelching sound came from the man again, however this time he could see something move under his chest. Suddenly two masks burst from the man's back, as if to look over the man's shoulders. They looked somewhat like Anbu masks, except more stylized, one with a cartoonish red grin and the other with a short, distended snout. As one they opened their mouths, revealing a mass of black and gray threads that composed them before the first released a massive fireball and the other, a ball of pure wind. The two attacks merged in midair, creating a roaring inferno that barreled towards Naruto like a small sun. However, when the attack hit there was no catastrophic blast, no intense shockwave as the energy contained within the chakra-empowered fireball exploded like Kikuzu would have and had been expecting. Instead he watched with marginally widened eyes as the attack slowly dwindled away in front of the blonde as he absorbed every ounce of chakra in the raging fireball. The ancient Akatsuki member stood there for a moment, grimacing beneath his mask as the monk finished up absorbing his ninjutsu. The blonde finally grinned as the last wisps of fire flickered away revealing him to be completely unharmed. Come on, is that your trump card? Big ninjutsu. Even though he was taunting Naruto was impressed, the man had displayed strong affinities for 3 elements already, an impressive feat however he was doing it. Come on now, you've put a fire in my belly, what else you got? Kikuzu frowned as 2 more masks burst from his back, this time one with elongated ears and a sick grin and another with a beak, making it look like a bird. The two seemed to charge huge amounts of chakra for just a split second before the second mask launched a drilling bullet of water and the first, a blinding bolt of lightning that as it passed through the air seemed to darken the space around it. Once again Naruto didn't even move from his position, absorbing the combination attack with ease. However, with each attack he was coming to understand Kikuzu better and better. Each mask seemed to represent an element and could fire off the respective ninjutsu. However, Naruto had yet to meet an elemental jutsu he couldn't absorb and each one only made him stronger, giving him more chakra to mold with nature chakra. However, Kikuzu hadn't lasted in the cruel shinobi world as long as he had without learning on the fly. While Naruto was temporarily blinded by the ninjutsu in front of him, Kikuzu's hands burst from the ground behind him. If Naruto could have seen around the attack he would have noticed they had separated from Kikuzu's body but were still attached to him through the threads. One hand latched onto the back of his neck while the other drove a powerful punch right into the base of his spine, aiming to paralyze or at least stun the blonde. However, what Kikuzu didn't know was that Naruto could in fact look around the attack with the 2 shadow clones hidden in the trees, sharing their vision with him. Gedu. Kusari. Leaving one hand up to continue absorbing the large ninjutsu, Naruto let his other form into a half-ram seal. As his chakra surged, black chains the width of his finger burst from his back, wrapping around Kikuzu's hands until they were completely immobilized. When the intense light of the combination ninjutsu faded, the blonde could easily see Kikuzu's intense frown from 3 different perspectives. How? Something like that should be impossible for a brat like you. How could you possibly do so many things at once? Kikuzu's voice wasn't hysteric or even urgent, but his deep gravelly voice contained a lot more irritation than before as the monk simply smiled. When you sometimes have to share your sight 6 different ways, you get good at multitasking. The chains suddenly constricted, making Kikuzu grimace again as he felt his hands slowly being crushed. However, before Naruto could do it, the masks on the Akatsuki member's back suddenly broke off of him, taking a huge mass of the dark threads with them that congealed into deformed, nightmarish bodies. Each creature rushed the blonde, forcing him to move out of the way and drop his ram seal, allowing the chains securing Kikuzu's hands to simply fade away. Once again the two were back to watching each other from across the clearing. However, this time the monster-like masked creatures had slowly surrounded Naruto. He observed them for a few moments. A Shinra Tensei probably wouldn't do much to them as they were simply a mass of threads that could evenly distribute the force. In that same vein, they were probably immune to most types of cutting or blunt force damage due to their unique makeup. That probably meant they were controlled through the masks, so he had to destroy those first. He grinned, deciding to test his theory as he placed his hands together. A burning purple flame formed around his clasped hands as potent yin chakra combined with life-giving yang. Banbutsu Suzu, Getsugasan. Slowly Naruto pulled his hands apart, and as he did, a long metal pole formed between them, tipped on one end by a large spade-like blade and on the other, a crescent moon-like extension on the end of a short chain. I may not be as skilled as Chiriku-senpai with this, but I've had a lot of time to practice over the last few years. He brought the monk's spade about so he was in a low forward stance, the spade itself behind him in a reverse grip so the spade pointed upwards across his shoulders. Chiriku. Of the Fire Temple. Naruto faltered for a moment as Kakuzu's deep voice cut across the silence. Yes, he has a bounty of 30 million ryo if I'm not mistaken. A worthy quarry. Naruto could feel the smirk cross Kakuzu's face as the black thread creatures tensed to attack. Perhaps after I am done here I should head over to Hai no Kuni. There are a few bounties I have been meaning to collect over there for a while now. When Kakuzu looked back around, Naruto's head hung a little lower, locks of his hair spilling over his horned headband to shadow his eyes. I'll never give you the chance, you will never hurt my senpai as long as I can stop it. Naruto's head suddenly flashed up at the same moment he spun, lashing out with his monk's spade at a seemingly invisible enemy. However, the attack he launched was far from intangible, as evidenced when Kakuzu's water mask suddenly split in two, the broken shards of the porcelain face falling uselessly to the ground as the creature simply seemed to melt. Before Kakuzu could compensate, Naruto had already lashed out 3 more times in an intricate dance of movements, launching near-invisible blades of wind in every direction. One by one the 4 masks shattered and broke, spilling blood to the ground as whatever was inside to control them was neatly bisected by the sharp blades of wind. Naruto let out a long breath as his hand slid down the monk's blade staff as he twirled it a final time before gently touching it to the ground, watching as it dissipated into black dust that quickly floated away. He turned, catching Kakuzu's eyes with his own as he straightened up, walking forward slowly. "You brat, this isn't over yet." Threads once again burst from the ground around the blonde, but he simply raised a hand as his eyes pulsed with chakra and they couldn't touch him, halting a few feet from him and allowing him to pass easily. Kakuzu took an unconscious step back as the blonde continued to advance. He was smaller than the Akatsuki, but at that moment he might as well have been a giant for as much as Kakuzu could stop him. Threads continued to harass the monk fruitlessly as he walked forward, either bouncing off his hardened skin or deflected by his gravity attacks. "Damn it, I refuse to lose to a brat like you. I've lived over 90 years and fought the Shodai Hokage himself. My legacy is too great to end here." Naruto ignored the man's words as he picked up his shakuju from where it had remained planted into the ground throughout the whole fight. He never broke stride though, getting closer and closer to the man until Kakuzu's back was pressed up against the barrier, unable to retreat any further. The first desperate punch was easily diverted to the side by a swipe of his staff, and that was all Naruto gave him. "Arg!" Kakuzu cried out as the end of Naruto's staff slammed straight into his stomach, doubling him over as he crumpled against the barrier. "You are an old man, clinging onto past glories, never having properly experienced life, too wrapped up in your own greed." Slowly Kakuzu's eyes widened as the red bled away from his sclera, leaving them white for the first time in over 80 years since he had stolen the Jongu technique from his home. "And I'll make you stop running from it." Slowly Kakuzu's body began to wither away, his skin losing its natural tan as it thinned and wrinkled. His hair changed from a dark brown to a snowy white as his eyes became sunken, spots appearing over his skin. What have you done to me?" His voice had lost its deep commanding edge, becoming frailer and weaker. It looked as though the man had aged a few decades in a few seconds. Even the threads that stitched his body together slowly vanished, turning to a dark dust that retreated back inside his body, probably reforming the organs and muscles that had been broken down in his life-extending technique. "I took away your chakra, the technique you were using has stopped, you're just an old man now." Absently Naruto heard the buzz of the barrier falling as it recognized his victory over Kakuzu, however he paid it no heed. "Now tell me about the Akatsuki." Haku breathed heavily, his breath visible in front of him as a wispy mist as he looked down at Tayuya's form. Her skin was pale, much paler than what should have been healthy, and little ice crystals had appeared all over her body. It didn't even look like she was breathing, her chest rose so slowly, but even so Haku couldn't help but let out a small choked laugh, a single tear sliding down his porcelain skin. He had saved her. He still wasn't entirely sure how the stupid, reckless, idiotic thing he had done had actually worked, but it had. He hadn't even really known what he was doing, his body moving purely on instinct as he used a medical technique designed to give chakra to a patient. Except he had gone against all convention when instead of using the special healing Iryo chakra he had instead used his own Hyoten chakra. It wasn't exactly freezing to Yuya, that would have had catastrophic effects on her body as the water in her cells expanded, but it did slow her body's metabolism right down to the point where her blood barely even flowed anymore. He cringed as he knelt back, a small smile stuck on his face. It had taken a large amount of his chakra to completely replace Yuya's and it would still only buy him a few hours at best. He needed to get her to Naruto. Right now he was the only one with a hope of saving her as she was now. There was only so much medical chakra could heal when there wasn't anything there to fix anymore. The puncture wound to her heart had completely ripped through it. The only reason she hadn't actually died was because of her lowered metabolism, meaning her organs didn't need oxygen for the energy they weren't using. Unfortunately for him he was now trapped inside the barrier with an Akatsuki member. He couldn't have performed the procedure outside of the barrier where his chakra was suppressed. Hell, he had nearly blown out a few of his tenketsu just making that one ice mirror to even get it. Even then he had taken advantage of the barrier recognizing Yuya as dead, to get in just as it came down. Unfortunately now there were two alive contestants, inside it had sealed right back up again. Come out girly. You took my sacrifice from me so you'll have to repay it with your blood. Hidan's voice echoed through the trees near where Haku had hidden Yuya. He breathed out again as he stood up. The only way out of here was through Hidan and that meant the only way to save Yuya was to take the Akatsuki member out as fast as he could. His eyes hardened as an ice mirror congealed below him. His chakra was low from what he had done to Yuya which only hardened his resolve to end this quickly. Hidan slashed through another tree, scowling his annoyance that his sacrifice got away. Even now he could feel her through the bond he had created even if the technique had ended. Her heartbeat infuriatingly sounding in his mind as the girl refused to die because of whatever that other girl had done to her. He roared out his anger as another tree was felled by his scythe, looking around furtively for any sign of them. However he paused in confusion as he rounded another tree only to see himself. No, it was his reflection in a large mirrored panel jutting up from the forest floor. It looked as though it was made from a block of ice yet had the perfect reflective surface of a real mirror. He approached it slowly, looking at his own reflection before grinning, noting the large amounts of blood covering his body. Hey there handsome, how yo arg? The silver-haired Akatsuki cried out in pain, spinning around with his scythe bared only to pause in confusion again. In front of him, yet again, was himself, or to be more accurate another ice mirror had sprung up behind him, showing him the large bloody gash on his back that was slowly healing over. However even as he gawked at himself he cried out in pain again, this time as a large slice appeared down his left arm faster than he could spot just who did it. Just like the last time, when he turned to attack his opponent there was simply another mirror, reflecting back his infuriated features. Normally I don't like violence. The voice seemed to be all around Hidan as more ice mirrors slowly rose from the ground, encircling the Jushinist and caging him in. A normal man might have tried to escape before they could be caged in, tried to break through one of the forming mirrors only to fail as they found the chakra-infused ice too strong. However Hidan had the arrogance of an immortal and simply stood his ground as more of his reflections sprung up. However you hurt my friend, so I'll make an exception. Hidan just grinned as he readied himself for the oncoming attack he could practically feel, just waiting for the right opportunity to wear down his opponent and get their precious blood. For him it was only a matter of time. However his opportunity would never come. As he stood there he suddenly cried out in pain as a long slash appeared down his back. Before he could even reach around to touch it though another appeared on his front, then his arms, and his legs. Before long, in probably what was only a few seconds, Hidan had been slashed so many times that there was more blood on his skin than there wasn't and for once it was all his own. Arg damn it you bastard, show yourself coward. Hidan panted, noticing his wounds appeared to be healing a lot slower than usual, not only that but it was getting a lot colder around him. The attack stopped for a moment before a figure appeared in the mirrors, all of them at once. Haku now wore his porcelain mask over his face again, casting a chilling image, the last Hidan would ever see as the man grinned. He rushed forward, scythe raised to slam into one of the mirrors bearing the ice wielder's image. However as he ran it fell limply from his hand as a small sanbon of pure ice lodged itself through his forearm, robbing him of movement in that limb. Ha! This is nothing, you little punk. However, before he even finished the last syllable, the more ice Senbon joined the first, completely tearing away Hidan's control over his limbs and causing him to slump to the floor on his knees. Damn it, once Kakuzu gets here and gets these damn shards out of my arms, I'll kill you, you hear? Haku stepped out of the mirror in front of Hidan, his eyes frosty behind the slits of his mask. No, you won't, now disappear. Hidan couldn't even scream as his entire body was engulfed in ice, freezing him permanently in place. Haku breathed out a long, steamy breath as the mirrors all melted away around him. He felt weak from the loss of chakra, but he had enough to go on. He had to protect Tayuya. Absently he cast one last look at the frozen Akatsuki member, stuck there forever like a living statue. Heal from that. Chapter 75, Clouds Part 13. Three things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth, Buddha. Naruto stepped back from Kakuzu's withered form. The man was propped up against a tree, breathing heavily. Apparently having his body suddenly catch up with around 70 years of aging all in one go was a stressful process. Naruto ignored the now aged Akatsuki member for the moment, a troubled frown on his face as he thought about what he had learned. However, as concerning as the information was, he still had to deal with the problems he had right now. His head snapped up though when he heard the faint buzz of the barrier coming down. He could actually see the glyphs and symbols of the kanji begin to change as it recognized his victory. Before his window of opportunity closed though, Naruto slammed his hand into the ground. Kuchios. The area around him burst into clean white smoke that died away after a moment to reveal his friends. However, it took Naruto no time at all to realize something was wrong when Haku was carrying a far too pale Tayuya. Naruto. Haku immediately spotted his blonde friend after the mild confusion of going through a summoning. 1 minute he had been running with Tayuya in his arms towards Uzushio, assuming that was where Naruto would be. The next he was here. Haku. What's wrong with Tayuya? Naruto frowned as he gave a precursory glance over the redhead, not liking what he was seeing. She seemed to have multiple stab wounds all over her body, her skin was pale and she hardly seemed to be breathing. Most worrying through was the hole in her chest that seemed to be emitting a constant trickle of precious life blood. Haku gently placed the girl down in front of the blonde, giving her a worried last look before standing back up to look at his friend. She faced an Akatsuki member. He had some kind of healing factor or something, I don't know. But he used a jutsu unlike any I've ever seen. I think it connected his body to Tayuya's because he stabbed himself through the heart and now she's like this. Naruto blinked. He had never heard this kind of urgency in his usually stoic and quiet friend. However, he had to admit that had he not gone through Tsunade's training to remain calm and collected in situations like this, he may have been in a similar situation. Gently he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, never taking his eyes off Tayuya. Nay, need to know the full extent of her injuries before he could do anything. Calm down, Haku, whatever you did to prolong her life is working, we have some time. Naruto could see the Hyoten chakra running through the girl's system. It was a foolish and makeshift idea, but it had at least worked as a form of stasis. Although had he been there, Naruto would have slapped Haku for attempting something so untested and reckless. He was still tempted, but there was a time and a place for scolding people. What happened here? Fu's voice cut in as the girl glanced about the destroyed clearing. Many trenches and craters littered the area, as well as more than a few broken or crushed trees, the obvious signs of a very intensive fight. There was that, plus the fact Naruto's robes were slightly tattered and there was a particularly desiccated man lying against a tree not far from them. That's our other Akatsuki over there by the tree, don't worry about him. Fu just nodded, taking Naruto's word for it as she continued to glance about, marveling at the destruction a fight between Naruto and an Akatsuki could cause. How are you two so calm? Both Jinchuriki looked around at their friend with a little shock. He had descended to a knee next to Tayuya and was staring up at them, his eyes a little red from tears. Naruto just smiled kindly as he crouched, placing a hand on Tayuya's shoulder. Don't worry, Haku, I once promised I would never let another friend die while I still had power to prevent it. If we aren't calm, we can make mistakes. We know how you feel right now, trust us. His voice was sincere and kind, and Haku felt a little of the tension on his shoulders relax, enough for him to suddenly rock back. He was exhausted and had been running on fumes since his fight with Hidan, and it was beginning to finally show as the adrenaline wore off. Come on, we need to carry on. I can't do anything to help Tayuya while my chakra is suppressed like this. I only had time to summon you guys before the barrier came down. Now that his fight was over with Kakuzu, he was under the effects of the island's spanning seal again. We need to find somewhere that's out of its area of effect. He looked toward the center of the island with narrowed eyes. I'll bet that's in Uzushio. After all, it made little sense for a village of shinobi and chakra-sensitive people to restrict themselves in their own home. Thankfully, carrying Tayuya proved to be little issue even with Haku exhausted and only barely able to walk. Naruto may have been prevented from expelling his chakra in any useful way, but techniques that were purely internal like Tsunade's strength were still fully accessible. The girl was light as a feather as he gently carried her bridal style. If Fu was at all jealous of the position, she wisely kept it to herself as the group moved swiftly towards the center of the island. One or two times they came across the barriers, but with Naruto able to spot and see them, they could skirt around Hiroto's commandeered arenas. However, it wasn't all that long before they came across a new problem in the form of an enormous wall that seemed to span the entire circumference of the village. That wasn't the problem though, the wall itself was shattered and broken, evidence of a long siege against its stoic facade. The problem was the massive barrier array that stuck to the wall like a second skin, not crippled with holes and damage like its material counterpart. All along it, Naruto could spot those same lightning-containing seals that mocked him, daring him to try and absorb the barrier's chakra. He knew the only thing that would get through this barrier was excessive force, the kind entire villages could muster with platoons of shinobi. Damn it! Haku collapsed onto his knees after being informed of their latest obstacle. Their situation just continued to seem hopeless as problem after problem was thrown their way. Naruto simply frowned as he walked up to the barrier. He traced his hand along it lightly and watched the floating kanji twist about his hand, unfortunately not letting him through though. Probably only a true Uzumaki can get through it. Gently he set Tayuya to one side as he continued to scrutinize the barrier, looking for a way to get through or bypass it. Hiroto obviously wanted them to proceed into Uzushio for whatever he was planning, so there had to be a way through it. Maybe it was just a matter of waiting for his annoying projection to show up, ramble on about inner selves or some other narcissistic nonsense before he grandiosely allowed them through the barrier. Then again, maybe. Gah! Naruto blinked as Haku suddenly got to his feet, an icy expression on his face as he charged the barrier. Throwing all his weight behind it, he crashed into the unyielding shoulder first. No more waiting, we have to save her. Undaunted by his failure, the boy simply took a few steps back before charging the invisible wall again, letting out a small grunt of frustration as once again the barrier refused to submit to him. He was about to charge it again when he felt a strong hand grip his shoulder. Turning, he saw Naruto's blonde mop of hair as the monk looked at the barrier, seeing what Haku couldn't with his rippled eyes. You know that isn't going to work, Haku, there's no use exhausting yourself over this. The darker-haired boy seemed to lose all his energy at that, his shoulders slumping and his breathing becoming a little heavier. But he wasn't sure how to finish that, staring up at the invisible wall that prevented them from moving on. With every minute it held them up, Tayuya's chances of surviving grew slimmer and slimmer. Maybe that was what Hiroto wanted. He obviously was aiming to whittle down their numbers with these seemingly pointless games and fights. Tayuya would just be another number to him. Haku's eyes hardened again at that thought, angrily slamming his hand into the invisible barrier, still a little slick with his friend's blood. Come on. Naruto looped his arms around his friend's shoulder, seeing as with that last little act of frustration the energy truly left Haku. However, amazingly, as Haku pulled his hand away, a sticky red imprint of it was left floating there, seemingly on nothing but air. Naruto caught it out of the corner of his eye and turned, watching with slightly widened eyes as the kanji around the handprint of Tayuya's blood pulsed excitedly before changing to an energetic green. Before the blonde's eyes, the bloody handprint was slowly absorbed into the barrier as the invisible wall itself slowly fell, leaking away in a large gate-like opening. Wow! It was incredible to watch as the shimmering wall of light slowly evaporated away, leaving a space large enough to fit an entire group of people through. However, the edges of the opening were wavering slightly, so before Haku could even figure out what was going on, the blonde had slung him over his shoulder. He dashed across and grabbed Tayuya, but more gently, and nodded at Fu as the mint-haired girl wordlessly followed him through the barrier in twin bursts of speed. Behind them the gaping hole slowly shrank until the invisible wall was once again complete and impenetrable again. What just happened? Haku was confused as Naruto jogged over to a nearby building that was in at least decent shape, putting both his quarries down on the dusty stone floor. He couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief as he felt chakra flood his body again like a warm soup on a cold day. Even Haku seemed to notice the change, gaining enough of his energy back to stand up and glance back towards the hole in the great wall they had just passed through. I'm not entirely sure. Naruto looked back as well, noticing that from the other side the floating kanji of light that made up the barrier seemed a little dimmer. But I think Tayuya's blood deactivated the barrier, at least for a short while. Haku frowned as he looked down at the redhead's almost peaceful face. But then does that mean? Naruto just nodded, also glancing down at the now infinitely more mysterious former Otokunoichi. Yeah, I think Tayuya might be an Uzumaki. She must not have known though obviously, after all Naruto hadn't made his own last name secret so something would have come up there between them. But how? Naruto simply waved the boy off as his face became more serious, crouching down beside Tayuya and lighting his hand up with green chakra. No time for that, we'll have plenty of time after we've healed Tayuya. Haku just blinked his shock. Before nodding dumbly, still a little dazed from his exhaustion and the entire situation. Alright. Naruto just nodded absently, not even registering the boy said anything as he completely devoted himself to what he was doing. He ran a green-lit hand up and down the redhead's body, checking for anything and everything that would need to be healed in order to stabilize the girl, starting with the chest wound. Haku glanced up worriedly as Naruto hummed in thought, his eyes focused on the girl but he didn't disturb him. As good as Haku was at healing, Naruto had been trained by Tsunade directly, right here he was the healer and Haku was just the inexperienced onlooker. However, with every frown that creased Naruto's brow or thoughtful hum that seemed less hopeful than Haku would have liked, the ice wielder grew more and more worried. Finally though Naruto looked up, the green glow from his palm fading, Haku felt like melting into a small, relieved puddle as a smile lit up Naruto's face. You don't need to worry anymore Haku, Tayuya will be fine. The blonde stood up, clasping his friend's shoulder with that same warm smile lighting up his face. You did great Haku, if it wasn't for you she really would have died back there, as it is now she'll be fine. Naruto left out the fact that a large reason why Tayuya was still alive was because she had taken the injury with nature chakra still filling her system and that had done a lot to lessen the damage, but he knew his friend was in a fragile state of mind right now and needed all the cheering up he could. Fu, come on, I'll need you to work off the slight damage the ice will have done to Tayuya's system and safely get her metabolism back up again. The mint-haired girl simply nodded, already tying her hair up as Tsunade had instructed her to when dealing with complex operations. Now that the imminent danger had passed, Haku sat down wearily against a shattered wall, looking up at the sky as Naruto and Fu began making preparations. However, after a few moments curiosity finally got the better of him. What exactly are you going to do? Naruto looked across, having been cleaning his hands by condensing water around them. It was something he had learned from Shizuku's memories. We're going to induce a mild form of Tsunade-sensei's meiotic regeneration. It'll grow back the damaged or missing tissue by replicating cells that are already there. However, instead of her full body technique, we're going to localize it to her wounds to reduce the impact it would have on her lifespan. Haku just nodded, understanding only a little of what Naruto was talking about. He had never felt more envious of the boy's tutelage under the famous medic Nin than he did right then. It sounds complicated. Naruto simply nodded as he continued to scrub his hands. Tayuya's main risk right now was bacterial infection from her open wounds, and while Fu would be dealing with that as Naruto dealt with the wounds themselves, he didn't need to be adding to her concerns. It is. Normally it would take something like Tsunade-sensei's yin seal to accomplish, both for the enormous amounts of chakra and the splitting of it into yin energy. However, I can do both of those things myself. It's going to take some time though, so I can take it slow. If I do something wrong, the new cells could easily become cancerous and divide too much. Haku just nodded again, wisely keeping his mouth shut and allowing the two more competent medics to do their work. In the meantime, he took glances out of the building they were taking shelter in, trying to catch a glimpse of Uzushio from where they were. It couldn't be far from here. As Naruto worked, he couldn't help but feel like there was something wrong, however he did his best to put it from. His mindset it wouldn't distract him. Hidan remained in the clearing Haku had left him in, his body covered in a thin layer of ice that wouldn't break or melt even under an A-ranked fire ninjutsu. To the side of him the air began to warp and twist almost as if a small whirlpool of air had opened up, rather appropriate for Uzu no Kuni. A moment later and a single figure was standing there, his Akatsuki cloak gently fluttering in the breeze. His world orange mask with the single eye-hole on the right side turned to the frozen Jushinist, observing him calmly even as the effects of Uzushio's seals became apparent on his body. Interesting, it is just like you said, I cannot expel my chakra. Slowly Black Zetsu rose from the ground beside the man, making sure not to fully emerge or risk being caught in the seal's effects as well. As long as he was still partially connected with nature he could use the mayfly technique to get away, regardless of his chakra being externally blocked. Then it is a good job your space-time technique does not rely on externally controlling your chakra. The orange-masked man simply nodded before walking over to the frozen Akatsuki member. How interesting, it appears they have a Yuki amongst them, or the Kyuubi Jinchuriki has somehow managed to combine elements and form Hyoten chakra. Though that's unlikely, yet I could have sworn the Yuki had been wiped out in the Kiri Civil War though, they were too dangerous to be left alive after all and I'm looking at perfect evidence for that. His voice was deep and low but it held a curious edge like a scientist discussing an experiment with a colleague. He did a once around of the frozen Jushinist before smirking underneath his mask. This really is interesting. Hidan's immortality always was a point of interest for me. I would so love to thaw him out to see if he could survive through having every cell in his body burst after the water in them expanded as ice. That was if I didn't end up shattering him by accident. I can sometimes be so careless when I work after all. Black Zetsu simply stayed to the side and watched in interest as the man took a hold of Hidan's left arm. With a swift movement he slammed the side of his palm into it, shattering the ice and completely detaching the Jushinist's forearm from the rest of his body. In any case I will be taking the ring back, you have no need for it now after all. It was almost as if the man was talking to the statue of a man, unaffected by the fact he was now holding a severed arm. After a moment or two though it seemed to disappear in a swirl of displaced air, seemingly sucked into the dark eye hole of the enigmatic orange mask. A moment later the man followed in a similar fashion, leaving Hidan exactly where he was, still perpetually frozen in place, sans his left arm of course. Kakuzu wheezed slowly, making his third attempt at standing up from where Naruto had left him against the tree. However his weakened, frail legs wouldn't support him yet and he only slid back down the tree uselessly. He would have cursed his frustration if he wasn't so ashamed of how weak and pathetic his elderly voice sounded. It was even worse because he couldn't access his chakra, just like the brat had said, it was like he was suddenly cold inside, void of something drastically important. Pathetic. The air warped next to the frail man as Toby stepped out of his technique, touching down on the ground without a single sound. To allow a mere child to do this to you, to leave you in such a state. Kakuzu looked up at the new arrival, blinking his confusion as he stared up into the darkened eye hole of the bright mask. Toby. The masked Akatsuki member didn't even seem to hear him, simply staring at him coldly. I had thought you would put up more of a challenge. I even had a small hope you would win. But here you are, finally showing your true age after all this time. Kakuzu was confused. In the Akatsuki Toby always had a bright, cheerful, and higher-pitched voice. Now it was deep, darker, and even foreboding in a way. It was unsettling how different the enigmatic man seemed. Oh well, in the end you served the purpose you were set, now tell me about the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Kakuzu could only stare uncomprehendingly up into that dark hole in the mask, seeing past it to the glowing red eye it hid, complete with 3 encircling tomo that began to spin lazily. He became lost in those spinning tomo as their rotations grew faster and faster until finally his world became dark. In the final stop on his trip Toby once again reappeared, this time in the burnt and scorched landscape of Fu's battle, staring down dispassionately at White Zetsu's limp form. He simply stared for a few moments, noting the absence of the ring on the humanoid's hand as his own hand curled into a fist. He looked around, observing the damage and trying to glean what he could about the Nanabi Jinchuriki's abilities from the aftermath of her fight. This place truly is cursed, I can see why he warned me away from this place. The masked figure sighed, giving another glance to the fallen Zetsu with a single narrowed eye. Another ring lost and I can't even be certain why. He grunted, looking up at the sky in irritation. Just being here and knowing his chakra was locked like this was aggravating. It made him feel weak and that infuriated him. No wonder he had always spoke about how annoying the Uzumaki could be. Finally he controlled himself, letting out a deep breath as his hand unclenched, his eyes becoming cold as a smirk crossed his hidden features. Well, we can't be down a ring like this, it's too inconveniencing. A chuckle escaped his lips as he gave a small nod thoughtfully. It was about time I paid a visit to a certain snake anyway. With that the man simply disappeared in a vortex of displaced air, vanishing as if he had never been there at all. So, she's stable. Haku's voice quivered with emotion like it never had before as the young Yuki stared hopefully over Naruto's shoulder at Tayuya's still body. Fu still knelt by the girl's side, keeping a careful watch over her now slowly healing injuries. However, her skin had regained some of its natural, tanned hue and her breathing was regular and normal. Naruto stood in front of him, wiping his hands with a small, happy smile of his own. Yeah, Tayuya's strong, I knew she would pull through. Haku just nodded dumbly, never taking his eyes off the redhead as Naruto tossed the cloth he was holding to one side. But now that we know she's okay, we have to move on. Hiroto's still waiting for us in Uzushio and who knows what that madman's been doing while we were here. Haku just nodded again slowly. Naruto wasn't sure he was even listening to what he was saying. Someone needs to stay with Tayuya, to keep watch over her and make sure her injuries don't open up again. I was thinking. Haku's eyes suddenly snapped around to the blonde, alert and focused with determination. I'll do it. Naruto just smiled softly, a hint of amusement in his rippled eyes. I was going to say it should be Fu, she has more medical experience than you and if something goes wrong wouldn't you feel better knowing she's there on hand. Haku paused, wavering a moment as his brown eyes flickered between the redhead and the monk. His head dropped slightly, one of his long bangs falling in front of his face. I still want to stay with her. I just need to. He was expecting Naruto to tell him otherwise, to stop thinking with his emotions like he obviously was. However, the blonde simply laid a hand on his shoulder briefly, already walking past him. I figured you might say something like that. He chuckled lightly, stopping when he was shoulder to shoulder with the darker-haired boy. You're pretty low on chakra anyway, even after that rest. Haku looked up, surprise evident in his features as he looked around. However, Naruto was looking right past him toward the ruins of Uzushio. Plus, his voice dropped to a whisper as the smirk on his face grew slightly teasing. I have a small feeling that your face would be the first thing she'd like to see when she wakes up. Haku gained a suddenly blush over the bridge of his nose, but he quickly recovered when he realized Naruto had carried on walking toward the village. Wait, you're not taking Fu. Naruto just chuckled, absently waving a hand as he walked off, not even bothering to turn his head. Like I said, I'd feel more comfortable with her tending to Tayuya. Tell her that, would you? Knowing her she'll try and run off after me. Haku just nodded as he lost sight of Naruto, the blonde disappearing down a hill. The Yuki never saw as Naruto's face lost its amused smirk, his features hardening and becoming set with determination. Naruto's shikuju clicked with every step against the hard concrete beneath him, the rings jingling in time with the bell in his hair. He moved forward steadily into the darkness of the underground passageway, only occasionally lit by a candle bracket on the wall. He was right in the heart of the village, some distance below it as he followed the direction his water sense was telling him Hiroto was in. Even if he hadn't had the ability though, Hiroto had left large, rather obnoxious signs pointing the way for him. Occasionally he would pass the symbol of the village inscribed on the walls, the once vibrant red paint cracked and peeling. The area he was in didn't seem too affected by the war that had ravaged the island nation, in fact it seemed relatively untouched by it. He would have guessed it was some kind of underground bunker-like area, possibly for storing supplies or maybe even for evacuation. However, he thought better of it when his senses told him this long corridor simply led to a single room, nowhere near massive enough to act as a civilian shelter or a storage room. Finally though, he felt as though he would get some answers as he passed the final corner and walked into the rather large chamber, this time more brightly lit by bright glowing seals that lined the upper walls of the room. Ah, there you are. We finally meet face to face at last. Please come in. Hiroto was there waiting for him, smiling brilliantly in his flamboyant white clothing as he raised his arms to the boy. However, Naruto paused in the doorway, his eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the ground in front of him, looking for seals that might act as a trap. He didn't see any though, which made him frown while Hiroto's grin only grew. "Oh, come now, my Victor, don't be shy. Is it incentive? Is that what you need?" Naruto looked up in confusion until he saw Hiroto take a step to the side, revealing the tired and weary form of Hinoka, chained up against the far wall, her head hung low. "Hinoka." Naruto took a step forward to rush to the girl's aid, but unfortunately for him he fell straight into Hiroto's trap. The white-haired man suddenly slammed his hand onto the nearby wall and Naruto could see the chakra he was pushing into a suddenly lit up sealed air. Before he knew it, the ground underneath him came alive with light as a previously inactive seal sprung to life. The blonde could only manage to take one more step forward before intense exhaustion washed over him. His eyes widened as he felt his chakra being leached from him and into the large sealing array inscribed on the ground. Aha! Yes. The moment has finally arrived. Hiroto bounced happily on the balls of his feet as he turned to a previously unremarkable wall behind them. Black kanji seemingly snaked their way in from nowhere, circling and slipping over one another in great chains of symbols until one massive, complex sealing array had formed against the wall. It burned with chakra, Naruto's chakra to be precise. The blonde could see where his stolen chakra was being channeled as the massive array lit up. How? Naruto ground it out through gritted teeth, fighting the strain of having his chakra forcibly stolen. There was no sealing array here before. Hiroto turned to him, still wearing that beaming grin as he practically skipped over the blonde. "Of course there was, my Victor." He said it tauntingly now in that chipper, victorious voice, mocking the downed blonde. Naruto was desperately trying to hold onto his chakra through his Preta path, but the seal on the ground was far too powerful. He had a feeling it would be possible in Sage mode, but his control was too messed up to even consider gathering Senjutsu. You simply couldn't see it because there was no chakra in it yet. The white-haired man mockingly touted a finger at the teen with a smirk. "You played your hand too early, my blonde friend. You let me know you could see chakra when you stared up at the barriers." He chuckled to himself as he turned back to the far wall where the new sealing array was pulsing almost expectantly. "On any other day those eyes of yours would positively fascinate me. It's not often you come across an entirely new dojutsu after all. However, today is my day. The day I prove all those half-brained idiots wrong." He laughed almost madly to himself as he walked back towards Hinoka, lifting her chin with his finger. Even thought the girl's eyes were dazed and unfocused from exhaustion. "They called me crazy. That Uzushio was nothing but a barren ruin picked clean years ago." He grinned to himself, however the expression was becoming more and more vicious as his hold over the redhead's chin grew tighter, causing Hinoka to whimper. "I spent years picking through these ruins, copying and studying every dormant seal, every little inscription that hadn't been burned away or stolen. Then I found this place, hidden where no other prying eyes had looked yet, deep within Uzu's heart. But it wasn't to be. I couldn't crack it, not as I was. So I studied. I learned. I mastered every seal I could find, but it still wasn't enough." He finally dropped Hinoka's head, letting it fall limply back down with another small whimper. "I was no Uzumaki. Their blood didn't run in my veins, so I couldn't access the island's defenses that I had so painstakingly put back together." He grinned though as he stood back up, looking down at Hinoka and throwing his hand out dramatically with an extravagant flourish. "But fate saw fit to hand me her. A real, breathing Uzumaki with their oh-so-precious blood running through her veins." He turned back towards the blonde, running back over with childish glee to skid to a halt just outside the draining seal's area of effect. From there it was only a matter of time before the island's amazing defenses were under my control. You experienced them yourself, the barriers designed to localize any fighting to specific areas where the rules could be changed to suit the Uzumaki fighting style. The chakra-suppressing seal that spanned the whole island to discourage invades passively, and the massive barrier array around the village itself, only respondent to the Uzumaki themselves. He grinned viciously as he turned back to the wall where the seal seemed to be finished glowing. "But don't you see? That was only the tip of the iceberg of Uzumaki genius. This is their vault, buried deep under the village. It must contain their secrets. Centuries of sealing knowledge that can be mine to learn and control." He turned again, his cape billowing out behind him as he pointed dramatically at Naruto. You were the final puzzle piece. I needed someone with incredible chakra in order to activate the seal. Even this Uzumaki girl didn't have enough. He waved his hand at the chained girl, the reason for her exhaustion becoming apparent now, making Naruto scowl and try to lift himself up again. Oh, don't bother trying to break that seal beneath you, boy. You need Uzumaki blood to deactivate it, and I'm afraid the only supply of it around here, beside that remarkable girl you brought yourself, is right here. He pointed to Hinoka as his smirk became crueler. But I don't think she's in any condition to lend some, do you? Naruto just growled again, straining against the seal's effects. However, he paused, looking down at a slightly shaking hand with wide eyes. Perhaps it wasn't like he had thought. Maybe his name wasn't just some randomly chosen last name. Tentatively he began to reach his thumb towards his canine tooth. NOW. He was shocked out of his daze as Hiroto stood proudly in front of the massive sealing array, a kunai in his hand. Let's see what's behind the door. He reached over to Hinoka and roughly grabbed her hand, quickly slicing across her palm and thrusting the bloody hand onto the sealing array. The massive sealing array pulsed even brighter in Naruto's eyes as the massive stone wall suddenly split, revealing an almost invisible seam that slowly widened, revealing the blackened room beyond. Chapter 76, Clouds Part 14. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Martin Luther King Jr. This is it. Hiroto almost screamed it out as the massive stone door ground open, sliding along invisible tracks with a great wrenching sound of stone scraping stone. Finally, with a tremor-inducing thump they stopped, unable to go any further due to the walls perpendicular to the great earthen door. There was a moment of deafening silence in the room as both Naruto and Hiroto couldn't help but try and peer into the darkened room beyond, seemingly a great chamber slightly larger than the room they were already in. The blonde's curiosity overwhelmed him as he strained his eyes to pick up even the slightest detail in the darkened room. However, he needn't peer for long as a moment later long-dormant seals slowly hummed to life, gradually illuminating more and more of the large underground chamber. Ever so slowly a massive library-like room was revealed, with shelves upon shelves of scrolls stacked up to the vaulted ceiling, with even more empty to receive more. You could practically feel Hiroto's excitement like an aura in the air as he took a trembling step forward on slightly shaky legs. This is it, the Uzumaki treasure I read about. It's finally within my reach. He hopped about excitedly from foot to foot before striding in more confidently, an ecstatic grin on his almost hysterical features. However, he paused when he heard a grunt of exertion from behind him, turning with an almost serious expression to see Naruto still straining against his invisible bonds as his chakra continued to be leached away. I won't let you. His voice was strained under the exertion of losing so much energy so quickly. However, now the seal was complete and had all the chakra it needed. The draining of his own had lessened and become more tolerable. Oh wow, you're still conscious and moving. Hiroto seemed genuinely curious as he observed the young monk. That seal, as far as I could tell, was designed to be used by 5 fully grown Uzumaki members, and it would still leave them drained. You really are a chakra beast, aren't you? Even the famous Kisame Hoshigeki would probably be out of it from that seal, and here you are, struggling against it. He sighed, giving a dismissive wave as he turned away towards the room. As fascinating as that is, though, like I said, more important things. With that he gave another extravagant flourish towards the library and without another word rushed right in. Naruto sank back down, struggling to keep his shaking limbs under control as he fought to rein in his escaping chakra. Now that the seal had slowed in its leaching, it was easier, but by no means easy. His breathing was becoming ragged. Finally he just gritted his teeth, figuring he had little else to lose right now than that small childish glimmer of hope that had always resided in his heart over his true family. He quickly bit into his thumb before smearing his blood on the ground. For a few heart-rending moments nothing happened. However, just as that small ember of hope deep in Naruto's heart was about to fade entirely, it burst back into life as the seal glowed a welcoming green before fading entirely. For a few moments Naruto just lay there, panting as he felt his chakra stabilize. However, after another moment or two a bright, ear-to-ear grin split his face. He had family. The idea was just alien to him, but he had it, real, honest-to-blood family. However, his gaze darkened as he looked up, spotting the retreating form of Hiroto's cape walking into the now lit room beyond this chamber. That man was about to disturb something precious to his family. He wouldn't allow it. He staggered to his feet, his head feeling a little faint with the little chakra running through his body, little to him anyway. The chakra that was coursing through his pathways would have been enough for multiple average Junin with some to spare, but for him, used to almost Biju level reserves at his disposal, it was like running on a near-empty tank. He walked forward, slowly regaining control of his body as he moved, eventually rounding the massive doorway to spot Hiroto standing by one of the shelves, one of his hands gripping the chain that still bound Hinoka's hands together. No, no, no. Hiroto had an angry scowl on his face as he threw what appeared to be one of many scrolls to the side, onto a small pile of them next to his feet. No, this isn't right. Where are the jutsu? Where are the sealing techniques? He cast aside another scroll, letting go of Hinoka's chain as he frantically began reading through scroll after scroll that he plucked off the shelf. Birth certificates. Marriage licenses. Who cares about this crap? Where are the techniques? Where is the treasure? He stopped, his eyes going wide, as he heard a slightly croaky chuckle from behind him, turning slowly to see Naruto illuminated in the doorway of the large library. You idiot, don't you see? Hiroto got over his shock quickly, too overcome by his rage at seeing the blonde still standing. He didn't even care that the monk had somehow managed to escape what should have been a foolproof trap. What did I possibly miss? He was spitting out the words in his frustration, the scroll he held in his hand beginning to bend from his tightened grip. Seeing that made the blonde frown. The Uzumaki obviously didn't care about techniques. What use are they to the dead? Their treasure isn't some ultimate sealing jutsu, it's family. Hiroto looked confused by that, dropping the scroll in his hand from his now limp grip. He blinked, looking around the massive room and all the scrolls contained within. Each was labeled with a name, imprinted proudly in bold kanji so that the memories of those contained within would live on past the siege of the clan. It was no wonder this room was guarded above all others if this was what the Uzumaki were trying to preserve. No, it can't be. Hiroto shook his head, bringing a hand up to clutch his temple as he kept looking around, feeling each of those boldly imprinted names mocking him just like his colleagues had. It's some kind of trick. There must be seals on each of the scrolls hiding the real information, it's just to throw people off. He began laughing hysterically as he grabbed another random scroll off the shelf, the inscription reading, Katsumi Uzumaki, in proud black kanji. I just need Uzumaki blood, it solves everything. He spun, reaching for Hinoka, however Naruto beat him to it, straining his weary chakra system as he raised a hand. Bansho Tenin. Hiroto's hand closed on nothing but air as Hinoka soared across the room, landing safely in Naruto's arms as the blonde continued to level a steely gaze as the white-haired man. It's over, Hiroto, there's nothing for you in this room. The white-haired man simply trembled in rage, the grip on the scroll in his hand tightening to the point where it just snapped in half, the delicate glass ends shattering and cutting the man's hand. It's not over yet. I just have to keep looking. The secrets of the Uzumaki will be mine. I've come to. He didn't get any further though as his blood dripped onto the floor, triggering a seal that reacted badly to the improper blood staining the ground. The dangerous kanji glowed an ominous red as Naruto's eyes widened, hand coming up to pull the man away from it. He was too late though, his tired arm not moving nearly fast enough as lightning suddenly sprung from all sides of the seal, centered on the white-haired man. His scream cut through the air as his body was burned and scorched from the intense electricity. By the time Naruto finally pulled the man out of the seal, his skin was reddened and in some cases blackened from the incredible heat and his limbs were twitching uncontrollably. There was a horrible stench of burned meat in the air as well as the scent of ozone, and Naruto couldn't help but cringe as he set the now certainly crippled man to one side against a wall before doing the same with Hinoka, channeling small amounts of his chakra into her to help her regain some energy. It seemed to work though as the girl managed to lift her head to look up at him, her eyes no longer unfocused or cloudy. Naruto. Her lips curled up into a small smile as she recognized the rippled orbs she was staring into and were looking back at her, filled with concern. I told you we were family, I knew it. The young blonde smiled back as the girl's head lolled forward again, unconsciousness finally taking her. The blonde made sure she was okay again before finally standing back, holding a hand to his head at the sudden blood rush. It had been a very long time since he had felt quite this drained. Normally his chakra felt practically infinite. However, he got over it quickly. It was all over now and Hiroto had been dealt with, at least for now. The blonde looked over at the man, twitching occasionally from the intense electricity running through his body. Without medical attention he would probably die from his burns, his body going into shock and shutting down. However, Naruto wasn't entirely sure what to do. He walked over to the man, looking down at him as the victor. He would decide this man's fate, whether he lived or died. A large part of the blonde thought the man was undeserving, that he was the reason Yuya nearly died and deserved the same fate. However, with a sigh the monk knelt down, his hand glowing green as he began to deal with the worst of Hiroto's wounds. Ultimately it was not Naruto's place to decide who lived and who died like that. The man was defeated, he would get what was coming to him when Hinoka recovered. If anyone got to decide the white-haired lunatic's fate it would be her. After all, she had been his prisoner for possibly months. When he had dealt with the most life-threatening of his wounds, Naruto got back up, walking towards the library again and taking another look around, a small lilting smile taking over his face. No matter what Hiroto had said, this room contained a priceless treasure. As Naruto let his hand drift along the many scrolls on the shelves, he knew that each name was a member of his family. Each name was a connection to something greater than him, and as he continued to glance at and ultimately memorize every single name in that room, an overwhelming sense of belonging rushed through his body. Finally he reached the far end of the room where a great mural was lovingly painted to the wall, still looking as fresh as the very first day it was drawn. It was an enormous spiral, circling and winding out from a center point, and occasionally along its length there was a name. As the whirlpool-like design got larger it branched out more and more until at its edges it was a complex and intricate series of branching lines and names. With a start Naruto realized it was one giant family tree, possibly containing every single Uzumaki that was documented in this room. Occasionally little symbols would be stamped next to certain names, other clans' insignias to indicate marriage out of the clan. There were a lot of them. Naruto just smiled as he traced the main branch of the whirlpool as it slowly got thinner and thinner to accommodate more and more names. Somewhere in this mural was his mother, or his father, and in another life, his name might have been inscribed here as well. Slowly he managed to tear his eyes away from the history of his family, turning back to the small pile of scrolls Hiroto had so carelessly discarded to the floor. One by one he picked them up, replacing them on their respective shelves until he came across the one the man had crushed in his hand. Carefully he unraveled it before grabbing a blank scroll from the end of the shelf, seemingly resting there for this very purpose. Slowly and meticulously he began to copy out the information inside to the new scroll so that none of his family would be forgotten. Uzushio may have been destroyed, but the Uzumaki were far from dead. The next week was one of recovery for everybody, in some cases physically like Yuya and in others, emotionally, like Naruto. However, the entire island seemed to have a certain calm about it, the ruins once again returning to just that, ruins. However, as Naruto sat atop the remains of an old concrete building, tilting dangerously to one side, he couldn't help but feel like a new life had returned to his ancestral home. Hiroto had been locked away until something could be decided about him, but that was far from the young Uzumaki's mind as he gazed out at the ocean from his lofty perch. "Ryo, for your thoughts, cousin." Hinoka appeared by his side in a flicker of motion, settling down on the tilted rooftop with a small smile on her face. Naruto just returned the small gesture, still not quite used to the new way Hinoka would address him. It was still just so alien to think he had an actual family. He knew the family he had built himself through his precious bonds was important, but the security of knowing that there were people out there that shared his blood in some small part was indescribable. "I was just thinking it'll be sad to leave this place. It really is beautiful when I try to imagine it as it used to be." Hinoka's face turned down at that, her smile saddening as she followed Naruto's gaze out to the ocean where large whirlpools could be seen raging at random intervals around the coast. The blonde had learned from Hinoka, who had succinctly learned about it from one of Hiroto's rants, that the whirlpools that gave the country its name used to be natural, until the Uzumaki harnessed them into a sort of initial defense. However, as their sealing knowledge grew, the need for the archaic defense mechanism became redundant. However, the whirlpools remained as an echo of the past. "So you're really going then?" Naruto nodded slowly, taking in a deep breath of the salty air. He wouldn't be able to smell it for much longer. "Yeah, it's great knowing that after all this time and everything I've gone through I have a home I can return to if I wanted." He smirked, patting the dusty rooftop and looking around at the wrecked village. "And trust me, I'll be coming back here." He lost the smirk as his features became more pensive. But there's still something I have to do in this world. Until I fulfill my purpose, it's not my place to settle down like this. Hinoka still seemed saddened. Naruto wasn't the only one to have recently found out there was still a part of their family out there in the world, and she was remiss to let it slip by her. But then, what's your purpose? At that the smile returned to the blonde's face as he looked around, the sunlight from the afternoon sun catching his hair and lighting it up as he beamed. I still don't really know, but I guess that's all just part of life. He chuckled to himself before letting out a long breath, looking back toward the ocean. In any case, there are promises I made that still need to be fulfilled. I broke one once and it nearly tore my heart apart. It's only thanks to my friends that it didn't. I never want to go through that again, so until I can secure peace for the people I care about, my purpose in this life has not been fulfilled. Hinoka just stared at the monk for a few moments, enraptured by his passionate speech before allowing a small, heartwarming smile to appear on her lips. You know, I didn't know our family, just like you, but at least from what I heard from Hiroto, and from what I saw in the vault, I would like to think they would be proud of that dream. She leaned over, wrapping her arms around the slightly taller teen and hugging him tightly before standing up, giving one last glance around at the ruins of her home. I can let you outdo me. I'm a proud Uzumaki too, so I'm going to do whatever is in my power to rebuild our home. I won't let another of our family go through what we did, so I'll make sure there will always be a place for us here. Naruto just nodded, a small unspoken bond forming between the two as they share their dreams. I think our family would be proud of that as well, so I wish you luck in your path. I'll be back at some point to take my place in my home. Hinoka just grinned, giving a small salute as she walked toward the edge of the building. And I'll make sure there's always a place for you here. With that she dropped off the edge, leaving Naruto alone to his thoughts again. The blonde turned back to the sea, thinking about the last week and all the revelations it had brought to both him and the people he cared about. He would be moving on soon, like always did, but that didn't mean he couldn't savor moments like these while he could. Haku. Naruto waved his hand over to the darker-haired boy, noticing that Tayuya's eyes had begun to flutter, a clear sign she was close to waking up. The young Yuki flashed over so fast he was like a blur, immediately looking over Tayuya's body before settling for her eyes, which were slowly opening. Ugh, damn, it feels like Jirobo was jumping on my chest. What happened? The young redhead slowly opened her eyes. The world was rather bleary at first, but a pair of concerned brown orbs were certainly clear to her. Haku. The ice user quickly nodded with a smile on his face as Tayuya blinked to clear her eyes and shook her head, peering up closer at the boy. Haku. The Yuki grinned as he nodded again, tears just beginning to percolate in the edges of his vision. Yeah, it's me, Tayuya. The redhead smiled weakly, reaching up a hand to touch the boy's cheek. Haku. Her smile suddenly morphed into a scowl as the hand gently reaching up became a fist that squarely impacted with Haku's cheek, sending the boy reeling. You fucking idiot. To the side, Naruto, Fu and Hinoka had large sweat drops hanging off the sides of their temples as Tayuya suddenly jumped off the bed, straddling Haku and grabbing him by the front of his kimono, shaking him comically. Why the fuck did you go and die, you shithead? She continued to shake the boy back and forth, causing swirls to appear in the Yuki's eyes. Tayuya. The girl finally stopped shaking the poor effeminate teen long enough to turn and glare at Naruto, her head still a little fuzzy from just waking up. What? The blonde flinched slightly at the powerful gaze until Tayuya blinked, realizing who she had shouted at, her eyes widening. Wait, so I'm not dead? Naruto shook his head quickly and a small smile began to spread over the redhead's face. However, he gulped as it immediately turned into a frown, quickly morphing further into a scowl as she roughly got off of Haku only to stride over towards Naruto. The hell, Blondie? You revive me with that messed up reanimation jutsu. Am I a fucking zombie now or something? Naruto's sweat dropped again. Tayuya must have been really confused after waking up or something. However, he quickly put his hands up, taking a subconscious step backwards away from the seething former kunoichi. No, I swear. Haku managed to freeze your body before you could die. We just healed you, no reviving at all. Tayuya paused mid-step, taking in Naruto's words before turning back to Haku, who had just managed to get up and dust off his kimono top. The redhead immediately gained a small bush over the bridge of her nose as she thought back to what she had at the time thought to be her dying words, although they appeared to be a little less dying now. Oh Likewise Haku seemed to be a little flustered as the two moved closer together, a faint trace of pink dusting his cheeks. Well thanks I guess. From the side Hinoka leaned over to Naruto, unable to tear her eyes away from the unfolding drama. Has your friend always been this tsundere? Naruto just turned to the girl, clearly confused. What's a tsundere? Hinoka just waved him off as she continued to watch the two blushing teens. Never mind. They both turned back as Tayuya finally seemed to work up her nerves, red now more predominant on her face as it slowly worked towards the shade of her hair. Well that shit I said. I thought I was dying and, well, however the girl's eyes went suddenly wide as Haku ducked in, stealing a small kiss from her while she babbled. However after a moment or two her surprise gave way to acceptance as her eyes became lidded and she leaned back into the intimate gesture. After another few moments Hinoka coughed awkwardly into her hands and Tayuya's eyes snapped open again as her hand reached up to smack Haku right in the cheek. The boy staggered back, hints of confusion in his chocolate orbs as he looked at the now heavily blushing girl. That was for freezing me you idiot. It was stupid and fucking reckless. She hesitated for a moment before leaning back in and kissing the pale-skinned boy on the same cheek tenderly. And that was for saving me I guess. Over on the side of the room Hinoka now had hearts in her eyes while Fu and Naruto exchanged a brief glance before leaving the room, dragging the other Uzumaki with them before she pounced on the new couple. Naruto smiled at the memory. Ever since the island Fu and him had been wondering when their two friends would finally work up the nerve to confess how they properly felt to one another. Naruto might have even placed bets with Fu if he wasn't a monk. After all they weren't subtle about it even if the other seemed completely oblivious. The blonde wondered if that was what the whole tsundere thing Hinoka was taking about meant before quickly shaking that out of his mind. The week had been filled with heart-warming moments like those, especially now that Haku and Tayuya were finally open about their feelings. So what, I'm an Uzumaki because my blood deactivated some barrier seal here. Naruto nodded, backed up by Hinoka. The three of them were sitting in a quiet, relatively sound building that was only missing its roof. But I mean, this place is pretty fucking huge, the Uzumaki had to have other clans or families living here right? I might just be related to one of them. Naruto could tell the girl was desperately trying to deny it in her own mind. Different people took life-altering news differently and Tayuya was just so used to the concept of having no kind of real family that the knowledge she was wrong was too much for her. Actually, the Uzumaki were well known for their red hair, it's very likely you were related to them. Hinoka spoke with a grin on her face, happy to convince the other girl that they were family. Naruto just ran a hand through his very much blonde hair with a slightly disappointed frown. Tayuya frowned as well, the options for not believing this becoming slimmer and slimmer in her mind. So that would make you guys my cousins or something right? Naruto and Hinoka nodded, the latter with an excited grin on her face. It's great. We could be anything from direct cousins through our parents to very distant relatives that probably would never have spoken to one another even if Uzushio hadn't been destroyed. I think it's exciting not to know, it means we aren't constrained by what we are to one another, we can just be family. Naruto smiled thoughtfully at that, not having considered it but rather liking the idea. Tayuya just looked down, her brow furrowing from her own thoughts. So what does that change then? Tayuya seemed genuinely confused by all this and Naruto knew it must be hard on her. Once the adrenaline had left his system it had hit him particularly hard as well. It doesn't have to change anything, to me you're still just Tayuya, except now I can call you family as well. On the other hand it could change everything, we aren't just nameless outcasts anymore, we have a home to always go back to or to ignore entirely as just a ruined island, people to count on thanks to blood or to treat the exact same way. It's up to you. With that the young monk stood up, placing a firm hand on Tayuya's shoulder before walking out, his shikuju clinking with each step. He paused outside though with a wince as he heard Hinoka immediately rush over to Tayuya, badgering her new cousin with a multitude of questions. The blonde just quickened his pace, not envious of the former Oto Kunoichi's position right now. When Hinoka wanted to talk it was hard to get her to stop. The blonde was broken from his reminiscing as he heard the grunts and shouts of sparring break out somewhere below him. It was probably Fu and Tayuya going at one another again. Ever since the redhead had lost to Hidan she had been particularly aggressive about sparring to shore up her strengths. She had even sucked it up and asked Naruto to help her, so he gave her tips on her taijutsu while she was in sage mode. The girl had a tendency to let the power of the nature chakra go to her head, sacrificing her technique for brute strength and power. It was effective when under the influence of senjutsu, but up against an equally powerful, or in Hidan's case unique, opponent it just wouldn't cut it. However, she hadn't been the only one to have been shown their weakness during this whole sordid affair. Haku had been shaken by his now girlfriend's near-death experience, and Naruto was sure he was off somewhere working on his speed or technique. Even Hinoka seemed to be getting into it, although Naruto wasn't sure if she was serious or just happy to go along with the group. It was obvious the Uzumaki girl hadn't had many of what could be considered normal friend interactions, not that anything Naruto or his friends did could really be considered normal. In any case, it was a good thing, as the girl had been very easily beaten by Hiroto, and getting stronger could only be a good thing. Even Naruto was not exempt from all this. Fu ambled aimlessly through the ruins of what she assumed to be training grounds. It was hard to tell with the debris and various craters strewn about the village. She kept thinking about how Uzumaki genin might train here, perhaps learning a new jutsu or going over some sealing technique with their instructor peering over their shoulder, looking for any mistakes to correct. The mint-haired girl sighed. It always made her nostalgic to think that her own childhood might have been like that had she not been a Jinchuriki. Of course, she probably would have never met Naruto, and such an idea for her now was almost unthinkable. She turned a corner only to come across a rather curious sight. In front of her for about 100 meters seemed to be a field where the laws of gravity ceased to exist. Small and large pieces of debris alike floated randomly through the air as if they were celestial bodies not bound by the constraints of the earth. Right in the center of it all sat Naruto in a deep meditative state, his eyes closed and legs crossed with his hands upwards, knuckles together. Naruto. Fu tried to reach the meditating blonde, but she got no reply, even though she knew that at this distance Naruto should have been able to hear her. She figured he must be talking with his tenants, which also meant he most likely wouldn't wake up anytime soon. With a small shrug, Fu stepped into the null gravity field, immediately feeling strange as weight ceased to have any meaning for her. She tried to put her foot down, but all it succeeded in doing was pushing her away from the ground. For a moment she just twisted about in the air, confused and disoriented. However, she got her bearings after a moment and grabbed onto a large chunk of a building that was floating nearby. With a shove she pushed herself towards Naruto, the debris floating off until it was out of the field, where it promptly fell back to the ground with a crash and a small plume of dust. The mint-haired Jinchuriki floated lazily through the air, actually rather enjoying the feeling of being weightless like this. Occasionally she would have to push off another floating rock as air resistance slowed her down, or navigate around some debris, but she soon reached where the blonde sat. She dropped gracefully to the ground as she reached the small 2-meter radius circle where gravity existed again. Fu gently tapped Naruto on the shoulder, waiting a few moments before the boy finally opened his eyes, the debris that had been previously suspended falling to the ground in a cacophony of noise and dust. Naruto blinked a moment before looking up with a smile. "Hey Fu, can I help you?" The girl blinked before pointing to the west where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. "We were about to eat." She looked around, observing the now gravity-occupied clearing. "What were you doing out here?" She gave him a quick look before he could give her the obvious answers of meditating, or training, and the blonde wisely rethought his next words. "I was trying to see if I have reached my peak with the Rinnegan." Fu raised a curious eye but allowed the monk to continue. "I need to know if this is it, if this is all I am able to do. Depending on the answer that I find, I have one of two options: either continue seeking further power from my eyes, or learn something new." Fu just nodded, joining Naruto where he sat. And she was curious now, so food could wait. However, Naruto just gave a shrug. "I'm not sure. So far the abilities of my Rinnegan have only presented themselves in dire situations or through intense training. When I think I have reached the limits of a technique, I suddenly find there's a new one, like an expanding puzzle in my mind that I am only beginning to collect pieces for." He raised a hand and a nearby piece of debris floated into the air as the gravity around it was suddenly reversed. "Learning to make things lighter was one of the first things I learned, but it was only after Sora suggested it that I tried making them heavier." He clenched his hand and the rock fell to the ground much faster than it should have, leaving a small crater. "Maybe you should do both." Naruto smiled at that, Glad for the input, he shook his head though. With enemies like the Akatsuki he couldn't afford to spread out his training. It would be better to master his own abilities than try learning something entirely new if it wasn't necessary. Well, I'm sure it will come to me given a bit of time. He grinned, getting up from his cross-legged stance and offering his hand to Fu, who gladly took it. Now come on, I'm hungry. The two walked off back to where the others had taken over Hiroto's old camp. Naruto knew that as long as he had his friends with him an answer would always come in its own time.